Hello, gifted youngsters, to another episode of What Happened, the show that was always destined to cover this particular game. I've got better jokes later on, I swear. There's a lot to be said about Activision's extensive back catalog of superhero software, so much so that it would take me hours to cover just a few, but I ain't Quicksilver, so today I'm just going to focus on the most troubled and controversial of them all, X-Men Destiny, the last official Homo Superior-based title ever released. Not only that, it was also the last game developed by the legendary What Happened All-Stars, Silicon Knights. It's an astonishing, uncanny tale of slash budgets, source material apathy, scope reduction, and even features a spicy lawsuit to top things off. So slip on your yellow onesie and retract those claws. It's time to find out what happened to X-Men Destiny.
Previously on X-Men.
It's 2005 and Activision is seeing sizable success with superheroes. Games like the Spider-Man movie adaptations and X-Men Legends had been doing great, both critically and commercially, and it was clear that there was still money on the table. So an all-new, all-different licensing agreement was signed with Marvel that would give Activision the rights to use pretty much any hero or villain they wanted in the context of non-persistent role-playing games. Basically, as long as the game was offline, had some form of RPG elements, they could go to town with whatever crossover nonsense they wanted.
Or nana.
Apparently, before this deal, Marvel and Activision were working on a game-by-game basis, so this was simply to help expedite their future dealings. With this new level of access to so many superheroes, Activision decided to mutate the X-Men Legends series into Marvel Ultimate Alliance, leaving a big X-shaped hole in their superhero strategy. To fill the void, they looked to Silicon Knights, who just so happened to have a very open schedule after shipping to Human. More on that whole thing in this video here. Silicon Knights were apparently caught in a bit of cycle of rejection. A series of big projects failing to attract publisher attention put them in a position where they would basically have to take on X-Men Destiny just to keep the studio going. These other rejected projects were chronicled quite exhaustively by archivist Mama Robotnik, which you can check out in the description below. I do want to quickly highlight one of those in particular though, because it's just so what happened as shit. Just as 2 Human was finishing up, Silicon Knights were working on a horror project they were hoping to pitch to Konami as a new entry in Silent Hill, which quickly fizzled out. It then ended up at Sega under the name The Box, until Sega suddenly pulled out.
Rick!
Yeah?
Who's the Plot King?
You are!
That's right!
The Box was then picked up by THQ but was renamed The Ritualist, but then THQ completely dropped it, then almost immediately partnered up with Guillermo del Toro to make the different but similar horror game Insane. Reportedly, Dayak was quite salty about this, so I imagine he put on a dark robe, mumbled Pargon, 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 and placed a surprisingly successful death curse upon THQ. Anyways, back to X-Men. Dayak was apparently less than enthusiastic about working on a licensed game. According to a former member of the studio, Dennis wasn't a fan of X-Men, and he viewed the project more as a necessity.
I've played the game quite a bit, and I've actually tended to go slightly X-Men most of the time.
Reality was quickly settling in though. Silicon Knights were no longer in a position to refuse work, because not a whole lot was coming their way. So Dayak relented, and a core team got to work on a prototype that was intended to take inspiration from Mass Effect, featuring an emphasis on story and character building, reasonable elements to build on for a game subtitled Destiny. It was originally envisioned to have open environments, a character creator suite that would allow players to build their own mutant, and a robust moral choice system. The demo shown to Activision skewed more towards exploration and character movement, but they still liked what they were seeing. Marvel signed off on the story treatment, a deal was signed, and some, but not all of Silicon Knights' staff got to work. Before we dive too deep though, I need to introduce ex-Silicon Knights member Julian Spillane, assigned to role of project director on X-Men Destiny. He had been hired partway into development as a firefighter of sorts to solve problems and get the main PS3, 360, and Wii versions shipped. Much of the internal information in this video comes from a recent email correspondence I had with him, so big thanks to Julian.
Aw, thank you, Julian.
He informed me and also explained on the Laser Time podcast back in 2017 that Dennis Dyack was very hands-off with X-Men Destiny, and even up to launch he always viewed it as a low-priority project. He accepted the deal under the pretense that it was going to keep the studio afloat while they worked to get more original IP greenlit, which they were always very unsuccessful in doing. Since Dyack was such a rallying point for the studio's general enthusiasm and creative output, X-Men absolutely suffered in this regard, as a good number of the staff, except those that were ardent mutant lovers, also began to view the project as just something that would need to be done rather than a labor of love. The other big reason Dyack was taking a back seat was because he was going to be busy preparing for litigation against Epic Games over the whole Unreal Engine 3/2 human debacle. Now, one doesn't just make a Mass Effect in 2 years, so it wasn't long before the X-Men's destiny would suddenly change course. Oh, I guess I don't have better jokes. Over time, the game would continually get reduced in scope, with the larger areas turning into basic corridors and the creative mutant elements getting all but stripped out. What made this whole process worse was the lack of staff available for X-Men Destiny. Dyack's main focus was firmly on Eternal Darkness 2, which allegedly became the studio's main priority up until the 11th hour, while X-Men Destiny desperately needed to ship.
Don't think you're profiting from this. Destroy it! It's a crime and an obscenity!
Kotaku would later uncover employee allegations that Silicon Knights spent a portion of X-Men Destiny's budget on Eternal Darkness 2, as well as siphoned staff onto it and away from X-Men. Dennis Dyack later pushed back on this, expressing that Silicon Knights had actually spent more of their money to help get X-Men Destiny out the door. Going off of information I received from Julian, the situation does seem to be pretty intricate. He maintains that some of X-Men Destiny's staff were indeed shuffled onto Eternal Darkness 2, but when it comes to finances, he believes it's fully possible that ED2 was being funded by government grants and Silicon Knights' baked-in profit margins from X-Men Destiny's budget, as it's not uncommon for big external studios to ask for more money than necessary. These extra funds help studios stay afloat in between projects, given that they would typically only be seeing meager returns on sales of their actual games, the lion's share of which in this case would have gone to Activision. Nonetheless, Julian maintains that it wasn't really money or manpower that was the project's big weakness. I mentioned earlier that the character creator had seen huge cuts. Well, once that happened, Silicon Knights decided to let the player pick between 5 pre-established original mutants, which would roughly represent the typical classes you saw in a lot of action RPGs. This phase of the design didn't last for very long though, because the staff soon realized that 5 characters was simply too much to animate and design with the time they had, so they cut the cast down to 3. Ninja Girl, Video Game Man, and Brian Battler. Funnily enough, one of the 2 cut characters actually made their way into the DS version as the singular default choice you controlled. And no, it's not Wolverine or Storm or anyone cool, it's Office Worker! I can't imagine why this guy was cut. The reason why they went with OCs is that Marvel had already approved the Create a Mutant plot where you become ethically torn between the X-Men and the Brotherhood. It was a core part of the game's identity at the time, and removing it just wasn't an option. But when Silicon Knights would end up reducing a bunch of choices the player could make down to just a few choices, and then even fewer choices, there just wasn't enough time left to completely rewrite things to let you play as, you know, characters you'd want to. So they shifted to Plan B, and these clowns were Plan B.
Why is everybody clowns?
This de-scoping and time crunch affected pretty much every aspect of the game. Levels were broken down to the most basic functions, featuring lots of invisible walls railroading the player into a lot of basic boss fights. And while the whole pitch for the game had included immersive RPG-like mechanics, these were simplified as well. Instead of traditional XP systems or skill trees, players would be presented with choosing between 2 mutant powers during specific fixed story beats, leading to very binary builds. These builds could then be altered very slightly by finding X genes scattered behind dumpsters or in other alcoves. I don't want to know why Juggernaut's DNA is just lying in a heap behind a dumpster, but I digress. Anyway, this led X-Men Destiny's gameplay to feel very— Hey, wait! Juggernaut isn't even an actual mutant! Well, what's going on?
You must not know who I am. I'm the Juggernaut, bitch! I'm gonna hit you with your own pimp!
These types of oversights were very typical with X-Men Destiny. Whenever Silicon Knights would put something into the game that wasn't jiving with established Marvel lore, more Marvel-savvy staff would often try to course correct. Julian regaled me with one such story. There was this general lack of knowledge about the X-Men from the leads and directors. On one of my first weeks on the job, I was called into a director's meeting to review the latest boss fight. It was a fight against the Juggernaut. They proceeded to show me the fight, which involved attacking Kane until his health bar depleted to 0. Afterwards, they asked me what I thought, to which I replied, "There's no way Marvel is going to approve this." When asked why, I told them it was because Juggernaut is literally and the idea of just giving him a health bar that depletes goes against the brand. Obviously, at this point, they weren't going to be able to redo the fight given time constraints, so they asked me how we could fix it. I suggested that you attack Juggernaut until his helmet is knocked off, at which point Emma Frost could use some kind of psychic attack that would damage him. Lather, rinse, repeat. I was told that I was focusing too much on unimportant details, and they went ahead and submitted the build to Activision and Marvel for approval. After that incident, Marvel sent us a stack of copies to the Marvel Encyclopedia X-Men hardcover book. I still have my copy to this day.
That's gotta hurt.
So, clearly, SK's disinterest with the franchise was slowing progress down, but another big reason the game was struggling was because they had lost their ability to use Unreal Engine 3 pending the Epic/Silicon Knights court proceedings and had to default back to their own internal tech, which Julian felt just wasn't where it needed to be. The engine and tools were very immature compared to what the team had become accustomed to with 2 Human, and it felt like every single day there were new technical challenges. Even simple things like getting art assets into the game were way more complex than they needed to be, and every feature request had to be routed through the code team. Many features that would make an artist's life more convenient were denied, likely due to the general apathy towards artists in the company from studio leadership. Unfortunately, a lot of it wasn't optimized for the Wii, and we had to do a lot of under-the-hood refactoring of the physics and collision systems just to get the game to run at a playable frame rate. We were also running against memory constraints regularly. The Wii version was dealing with out-of-memory crashes up until the 11th hour of development. So not only were there scheduling problems, design problems, and technical problems, budget problems also started to rear their ugly head. In an IGN Unfiltered episode, Dennis Dyack stated that once Disney got involved with the purchasing of Marvel, X-Men Destiny's budget was slashed, and Julian was able to corroborate this for me. The Activision deal was really expensive, and given that Disney was now involved in the equation, it was getting less and less likely that games produced under this deal would be profitable, given how much they had to recoup to cover production, marketing, and the actual license fees. Disney also seemed like they wanted out of the agreement because they already had their own games division internally. I don't think this was solely the reason that XMD had its budget cut. I think it was a contributing factor, but the game getting lukewarm internal reviews from Marvel and Activision is probably what caused the push to reduce the budget. At some point in 2010, the move was made to put the game under the Activision Value brand, which operated out of the Minneapolis offices, most known for Cabela, Hot Wheels, and other licensed titles. This meant reducing the remaining budget for the game's last year of development. Unfortunately, stories like this weren't exclusive to Silicon Knights or the X-Men brand in general, as it was just something that had started rippling through Activision at that time. Licensed games are starting to go out of style in an industry that was trending towards a heavy focus on annual mega franchise releases. X-Men Destiny then found itself in an unenviable position, an original spin on a licensed brand that was failing to appeal to both hardcore Marvel fans and general audiences, the worst of all worlds, and it would soon need to face its own, unique set of challenges. X-Men was set to release just before the end of September 2011, and while there wasn't a ton of competition released day and day, gamers were most likely busy with everything else that had flooded store shelves that month. We're talking Dead Island, Resistance 3, Gears 3, Warhammer 40k, Space Marine, RE4 HD, and Sega's rather rough attempt at Thor.
It's lucky you're beautiful because there's nothing up here.
What? That's mean.
Suffice it to say, the mutants had an uphill battle here for people's attention. Wait, I'm not done! Just a week after X-Men's launch, Dark Souls, Rage, and Spider-Man Edge of Time dropped the fuck! Who's the butthead at Activision who thought releasing two superhero games a week apart was a good idea?
Destroy them all! Bobby, shut up!
What certainly didn't help all this was the critical drubbing X-Men Destiny received from review outlets, leaving it sitting pretty at a 47 average on Metacritic, with the Wii version bottoming out at 36. Surprisingly, the DS version, which was developed by Other Ocean Interactive, actually fared even worse, which is a shame considering it's a completely different game, so you'd think it might be better or something, I don't know. Common critiques of the Silicon Knights version included substandard graphics, spotty performance, simple gameplay, poor level design, uninteresting new characters, pretty much everything. No version of the game showed up in any charts anywhere in the world, so there are unfortunately no reputable sources to determine its lifetime sales, so it's safe to assume they were absolutely in the toilet, but not like a regular toilet, more like a Morlock toilet. 50 feet underground! Unfortunately, things only got worse in the subsequent months. Silicon Knights' failure to win their lawsuit against Epic in May of 2012 resulted in $4.4 million in damages, which would have come out of Silicon Knights' coffers.
Ooh, my wallet's empty!
What's more, they and their publishing partners had to destroy all unsold physical copies of 2 Human and X-Men Destiny, as during the court proceedings, Epic had proven they were using stolen Unreal Engine 3 code. This was then followed up by the 1-2 punch of that aforementioned Kotaku article, which exposed the misbehavior of Silicon Knights' upper management, as well as those complicated business practices, further hurting the company's already dwindling reputation. Less than a year later, Silicon Knights was out of money, and with no publisher willing to work with them, closed their offices in May of 2013. Over the course of the next year, Dennis Dyack would move to create a new studio, Precursor Games, and will publicly fire back at Kotaku with a near 34-minute video response, categorically denying their claims. Try not to be shocked, but this did not help matters much. Regardless, Precursor also failed to release any tangible products, and honestly, while I'm kind of done talking about Silicon Knights at this point, I do have one small update. In 2018, Dyack announced he had opened a third company called Apocalypse Studios, and was working on a free-to-play RPG called Dead House Sonata, which, 4 years later, appears to be no closer to launching. X-Men Destiny and every other Activision Marvel game was then delisted in 2014, although some did manage to see re-releases not too long after, before then getting delisted a second time. Activision continued shipping licensed games, although way less, both new and old through 2016, before ultimately focusing on their PC/console development completely with their own internal brands. Fortunately, in 2022, I'm happy to report that Activision Blizzard is doing better than ever. Oof, so while this has been one of the most eye-opening stories we've ever covered, you have to admit it's impressive X-Men Destiny even came out at all, considering all the crap it went through, and with Disney's dark silhouette looming around the back half of its development. As for Julian Spillane, he opened Komi Games, who released the fantastic Power Stone-esque brawler Mighty Fight Federation, and even provided additional support on titles like Psychonauts 2 and The King of Fighters 15. It's with him we'll leave on. There's a lot of negativity about this project, and most of it is justified, but I am proud of the fact that we actually shipped the game, given everything that it went through. And I can't overstate how talented the team working on it was. Mired with technical issues, bad management decisions, and a lack of priority, the team still managed to execute and deliver on milestones, and make something that, while not great, was still an actual functioning game. And it's an absolute miracle that it happened, given the state it was in when I joined the project. As for the cast of X-Men Destiny, well, they're now considered cornerstones of the Marvel Universe. Thanks to Julian once again for answering my questions, and if you out there know of any other superhero software scandals, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or enter the X-Mansion, that is the Flophouse VIP Patreon, and become a big boss and nominate what you'd like to see in the future. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Welcome back to another blood-drenching and family-avenging episode of What Happened, the show that semi-regularly documents the developments of various missteps in pop culture media. And really, few things in pop culture media were bigger missteps than the majority of early 2000s comic book movies, because outside of a few breakout blockbusters, pretty much all of them and their associated heroes and villains needed to be hard rebooted in some shape, way, or form further down the line. But out of all of these characters, none are more familiar with the reboot hammer than Frank Castle, who has been portrayed by 4 different actors in 4 different continuities in the last 30-some years, which is the current record for a Marvel Comics character. While you could wave off the Dolph Lundgren version as an isolated project since it was also straight to video, really it was the 2004 theatrical film starring Thomas Jane and John Travolta that really kicked off, or kicked down, the skull-wearing anti-hero's rough relationship with Hollywood. So strap on your boots and put on your body armor as I answer the question, what happened to The Punisher 2004?
Talk to me, punk.
In the late 90s, Marvel started giving away the movie licensing rights for pretty much all of their characters in a bid to simply avoid bankruptcy, because comic book sales across the board were at an all-time low, which was the style at the time. Blade was the earliest of these projects to come to fruition, and when that proved to be a small commercial hit, followed by the bigger success of X-Men in 2000, Marvel inked a giant deal with Artisan Entertainment to option 15 of their heroes for further cinematic and TV adaptations, which included some heavy hitters, like Captain America, Thor, Ant-Man, and Deadpool, which, sure turned out quite differently in the years to come. Artisan was a bit of a weird choice when you look back on this deal, as they were very much not a major studio, but you gotta remember when this deal was made, Marvel's expectations were still on the lower end of the spectrum. They did have the foresight, though, to make sure the deal included more power with both the production and writing phases, as long as they fronted a bit more of the cost. So The Punisher got up and running first, with Hollywood legend Gale Ann Hurd being installed as a producer, who was also pulling double duty on Ang Lee's Hulk around the same time. Artisan, not having nearly the same pocket depth as Universal, sought out more unknown first-time talent to direct, and eventually hired one Jonathan Hensley to fit that role. Hensley certainly had experience with blockbusters, but just not in the directing chair, as he had exclusively worked as a writer on such features as Jumanji, The Saint, and Die Hard with a Vengeance. Still though, he was excited by the opportunity, as in addition to directing, he also co-wrote the script with Michael France, who was also not a stranger to action thrillers, having worked on both Cliffhanger and GoldenEye. The pair incorporated two specific comic book arcs into their script, which, while not the first red flag of the story, that would be the deal with Artisan, certainly represents a close second. The first of these main sources of inspiration came from Garth Ennis, the co-creator of The Boys and Preacher, who started his 9-year run penning The Punisher with Welcome Back Frank, a madcap, darkly comedic return for the character that was stuffed with over-the-top scenarios and wacky characters. The second literary source came from The Punisher Year One, a serious retelling of Frank's origin story that put more focus on the immediate aftermath of his family's death, with lots of emphasis placed on tertiary characters like a reporter covering Frank's case. As some might expect, these two ingredients didn't necessarily mix all that well, and considering the original intention with this film was to present a bleak, dramatic take on the character, Welcome Back Frank perhaps wasn't the best jumping off point. If the filmmakers had waited just a few years longer, they could have based the script off the incredibly dark and violent tales from Ennis's Max run, which kicked off in 2004. But we can't stress too much about the supposed does and never wases, because regardless of the source material, the original script was always going to go through some very drastic changes due to budgetary concerns, executive interference, and one major star's preference for the sunny skies of Florida over Frank Castle's far more appropriate New York stomping grounds. When it came time to cast their Punisher, Marvel Studios founder and producer Avi Arad and Jonathan Heinsley's first choice was Thomas Jane, who, while a supporting character in such films as The Crow, City of Angels, Face Off, and Deep Blue Sea, finally started landing bigger roles in the 2000s, as evidenced by Dreamcatcher and Stander. However, he wasn't exactly a superhero enthusiast, so when he was offered to step into the black boots of Frank Castle, he emphatically turned it down, as in his youth he had been a fan of sci-fi and horror comics, but steered away from costumed heroes. Arad and Heinsley were adamant though, and sent another offer and sat down with Jane to explain that Frank wasn't Hulk or Captain America, but instead just a regular family man with a military background who sought revenge once the justice system failed him. This detailed backstory, along with being shown the striking art of Tim Bradstreet covers from Ennis's initial run, proved to be the tipping point, and spurred Jane to dive headfirst into the material. You can't have a protagonist without a good antagonist, though, and well, that's not really true in the Punisher's case, because his main enemy was always, the violent crime of America in general, and he kills pretty much all of his enemies, but yeah, you can't make a Hollywood film without a good antagonist, though, so one would need to be created in mob boss Howard Saint, but who should play him? Well, since The Punisher was being helmed by a first-time director and its main star was still an up-and-coming actor, I'm to assume the thought process here was to get a big name for the villain. And since they couldn't find one, they settled for mid-2000s John Travolta. No disrespect to the man's amazing work throughout the 90s, but the mind behind Battlefield Earth had seen a pretty big drop-off by the time he was cast as Howard Saint, but his hiring would have more ramifications than just his name being on the marquee. With pre-production and prep finished and Jane having completed 7 months of training with real Navy SEALs, filming was set to begin. But at the 11th hour, Heinsley was given some news he wasn't particularly happy with. He had requested and expected a budget somewhere in the neighborhood of around $64 million, which was fairly appropriate for an action movie of this scale, especially with one kicking off with an explosive flashback of Frank's military career serving in Kuwait. Heinsley unfortunately was denied this and given less than half, roughly $30 million, and only 52 days to shoot it. This would be an incredibly tight schedule for any production with several big action sequences, as they often required weeks and weeks of prep, and even less so when you consider this being his first time in the director's chair. Artisan wouldn't budge though, and Heinsley was forced to rewrite and straight out cut several elements from the film, which, you guessed it, included the opening military flashback. Anyway, I said artisan again, which is technically wrong, because at this point in the story, there were no longer Artisan Entertainment, but instead Lionsgate. Yes, this whole big dumb thing. Artisan were actually looking to be bought out just before The Punisher began shooting, with Marvel themselves putting in a potential offer, which would have essentially given them their own movie-producing studio as early as 2003. If that had come to pass, then there's no telling where the superhero movie landscape would be today, but suffice it to say, it doesn't really matter. Lionsgate Films reportedly put in the most lucrative offer, and thus Artisan became Lionsgate, and Lionsgate had even tighter purse strings, which might have been a factor as to why the Punisher's budget was suddenly slashed. It doesn't end there though, because that was just the first of a 1-2 punch that Hainsley and his production crew would need to take on the chin. Even though its main star was sold on the idea of a dark and brooding tale of revenge, it would not be done in front of the backdrop used by most of the source material he had been pitched with. Thomas Jane, in an interview with Arrow in the Head podcast, said the following: "I wanted to make that gritty New York realism, and then they hired John Travolta, and John didn't want to leave his home state of Florida. So we had to change. This is after I already signed on the dotted line, and they're like, oh, it's gonna take place in Florida now, and Jesus Christ, what have I gotten myself into?" John Travolta didn't want to shoot too far. He's a pilot, so he's like, listen, we can shoot somewhere where I can kind of fly my plane to work every day, but I don't want to fly for too long. So we shot in Tampa because John Travolta was the bad guy. It should be noted, this contradicts statements from Michael France, who in an interview from 2008 said it was his idea to shoot in Florida, as it would help save a ton of money in the long run. But considering John Travolta is a licensed pilot and does own a massive home in the state, I wouldn't be surprised if the explanation from Jane is the more accurate, or less diplomatic one. But yeah, regardless of the true reason, two major components of The Punisher had to be changed before filming even got underway: a drastically reduced budget and a complete 180 in terms of shooting locations. Swapping out the dank alleys of New York, or a New York stand-in, in lieu of the palm trees of Florida didn't sit quite right with Jane, and when production finally began, he could sense the film was already taking a different tone than he had envisioned. Jane revealed that he was constantly pushing for the director to keep the tone grounded as a gritty thriller, although that wouldn't exactly be easy given the amount of scenes lifted straight out of Welcome Back Frank, which constantly juxtaposed humor and absurdist violence. Jane's feelings were met with resistance from pretty much everyone else higher up the totem pole, from producers to executives who reasoned that dark and gritty comic book movies just wouldn't work, an opinion most likely formed in the wake of such hits as Spider-Man and X-Men. Jane said to Joe Blow that this mentality was due to Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins still being a few years out, because when it did release and became one of 2005's biggest smash hits, those perceptions within Hollywood quickly changed. Going back to that absurdist violence, I have to bring up the infamous fight between Frank and the Russian, a near superhuman heavy sent by Travolta, Saint, who is meant to put an end to Frank's one-man war against crime. This fight resulted in the biggest injury on set, as Jane was scripted to stab Nashi in the shoulder with a prop knife, only to mistakenly do so with a real knife meant for close-ups. A consummate professional, Nash no-sold it and acted out the spot as written, which is reportedly the take used in the final film. Jane profusely apologized, but by all accounts, the wound wasn't serious. Nash was stitched up and asked for a round of beers to be bought for him at the end of the day. Now that's a wrestler.
Oh yeah, I got this. What a pittance!
Even with the tight schedule, a lot of material was shot, and guess what? Much of it wasn't even included in the theatrical cut, or ever at all. While the film is indeed rated R, apparently the MPAA ordered several alterations to greatly tone down the overall level of violence, including the Russian fight, Frank's final assault against Saint's home. Pretty much every action set piece saw some significant cuts. One of the most interesting things to happen during this editing process, though, was a version of the film that had an almost non-existent score, which Jane spoke about in the Arrow in the Head interview. He had attended an advanced screening where the vast majority of music was not yet implemented, except the very last scene where Frank faces off against rascally old Howard. Jane recalls this having a profound impact on the entire tone of the film, making it feel unique and dreary, and when the music finally did kick in, it provided a massive emotional payoff. He felt this made for the superior cut, and that when the full score was eventually added, it made the final version feel more typical and even, rather than being a slow burn with an explosive end. For whatever reason, Lionsgate decided to release The Punisher, an action film where the protagonist swears revenge against those that destroyed his family, directly against Kill Bill Volume 2, an action film where the protagonist swears revenge against those that destroyed their family. Not surprisingly, The Bride sliced up Frank at the box office, scoring a $25 million opening weekend against Frank's lowly 13. In terms of lifetime worldwide numbers, The Punisher only managed to shoot up $54 million, which barely covered its initial cost and doesn't even take into account the marketing budget that went into it. That's bad enough that Frank's cinematic journey might have ended right then and there, but in a bit of a swerve, his debut on DVD was far more lucrative, selling just shy of 2 million copies in its first 5 days. This success then brought about the extended director's cut in 2006, which reinstates a previously cut side plot as well as the opening Kuwait scene, albeit in animated form. It was this reception that encouraged Lionsgate and Marvel to give the character a second shot, with both Hainsley and Thomas Jane returning, but that wouldn't last very long. Hainsley reportedly submitted a draft for a sequel, but Lionsgate either demanded changes or rejected it outright, which caused the director/writer to drop out of the project completely. Jane stayed on, but after a brief flirtation with Rob Zombie possibly stepping in, Walter Hill, the director of such films as The Warriors, 48 Hours, and Streets of Fire, was in talks to give Frank his next mission, but ultimately he couldn't reach a deal with Lionsgate, which Thomas Jane was not happy about, saying, "We met and fell in love with each other and went to the studio. Walter said, I'll write it and direct it, and that'll be that." They ended up saying no to Walter Hill for reasons that are beyond my ability to comprehend. That's when I said, if you're not going to make the perfect Punisher film with the perfect guy, then who else do you got? They floated another director who hadn't really done anything in that ballpark, and so that's when I had to pull out. I had to say, listen, I'm not sure if you guys really understand what it is you're doing, therefore the chances of fucking this up are pretty high. The whole project was then rebooted into The Punisher Warzone, which released in 2008, made even less than the last film, and just so happens to be prime What Happened material as well. Thomas Jane did return to the role of Mr. Castle in a way with the Dirty Laundry short film, which in 2011 blew YouTube up in its earlier days, amassing over 30 million views and presented the style and tone Jane was always shooting for. This unfortunately didn't catch the eyes of the powers that be, but Jane is proud of what they shot in a single day regardless. It's unclear what the future of Frank will be in the world of dramatization, but as of right now, Jon Bernthal is set to portray the character once again in the rebooted Daredevil show that, has its own set of currently ongoing problems. Can't Frank catch a break? If you know of any other bullet-riddled development tales in the movie or video game industries, drop a suggestion in the comments below or enter the battle van that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Hello and welcome to another dark, dreary, and occasionally eerie episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that strives to illuminate the darkest shadows of the video game industry. And this week, we'll be doing exactly that as we pry open the decaying, sticky tomb of Acclaim, who are absolutely in contention for being the publisher I've covered the most in the entire history of the show. The late 90s were an especially trying time for them, equaled only by the 2000s, which were even worse. Unfortunately, one particular franchise got caught up in the middle of these hard times, to the point one might actually think they're on the receiving end of some type of voodoo curse. So grab your dead-side pistols and moldiest teddy bears as I answer the question, what happened to Shadow Man? In 1994, Acclaim were arguably at the top of their game, still enjoying the profits from the home ports of Mortal Kombat 1 and 2, NBA Jam, and getting cash injections by a telecommunications company called, Telecommunications Incorporated. So, with their coffers filled to bursting, they did whatever an intelligent and financially solvent company does. Spend all of it! Comic books were still really hot in '94 and was a sector that the upper crust of Acclaim management thought they should invest in very heavily. Perhaps too heavily, as they wound up outright purchasing Valiant Comics, as I assume DC and Marvel were out of their price range. That price range being, well, $75 million, which is what they put up for Valiant. However, by the time this purchase was made and completed, the comic book market steered itself into a nosedive by 1996, which is generally considered to be one of, if not the lowest point the industry had ever sunk to. So, yeah, Acclaim were not making money back on Valiant, but what they did have was a fairly rich cavalcade of comic book characters which to base future video games on. The first of these ventures, as many fans of What Happened should know, was the son of Stone himself, Turok the Dinosaur Hunter, which was handled by Acclaim's Texas-based studio Iguana, and evolved over the years, although sometimes not always successfully. Let's just hope that works out better in the future. Acclaim were not done throwing around cash though, as they went on to make other purchases across the gaming space, such as Optimus Software, which was founded in 1988 by Jason and Darren Falkus. Optimus didn't get up to much in their earlier days, what with the likes of a caveman with an abnormally large nose. But once Acclaim purchased them, they were put to work helping Iguana with ports of the insane Batman Forever arcade game and the N64 version of Forsaken. They were then redubbed to Acclaim T-Side and were given the opportunity to kick off their next project, which would hopefully become the next Turok. Speaking to Retro Gamer magazine in their 207th issue, quick aside, everyone should have a Retro Gamer subscription, Acclaim T-Side co-founder Jason Falkus explained how it all went down. Acclaim sent a load of Valiant comics to our studio and asked us if we'd like to pitch for a game based on any of them. We looked through them all, and Shadow Man stood out as being perfect for the transition to a video game. We felt it filled the gap in the market for a platform adventure game with a darker, more mature theme, as well as a rich storyline. However, in a very interesting and early twist in the story, as per the Retro Gamer article, there might actually be two fairly different origin stories on how Shadow Man originally came to be. Senior designer Simon Phipps recalled on his own website that initially, Acclaim higher-ups had asked for an all-original new IP that could compete with Resident Evil, but would have the added advantage of being fully 3D, and not rely on pre-rendered backgrounds and static camera angles. T-Side then sent back concepts for a dark story focusing on a former NYPD cop turned monster hunter named Thomas Deacon, so imagine combining Max Payne and The Suffering, which is something I would absolutely fucking play. Acclaim HQ, however, rejected the pitch and instead sent back a bunch of Valiant material and asked which comic book would best work with the third-person 3D engine they were proposing. Regardless of how it started though, T-Side were quick to hone in on Shadow Man, aka Michael Leroy, who protected the barrier between the land of the dead, appropriately named Deadside, and the living world. Jason Falkus was aware this was T-Side's opportunity to really prove that they could deliver something special, so he made sure to prioritize Shadow Man's development, saying to Retro Gamer, "Shadow Man was very close to my heart as it was an opportunity for us to show we could create a new game IP and make our mark as a creative force. It was an excellent storyline. It took the main characters from the comic and added in a fantastic mix of original characters and some really imaginative locations between the two worlds. Jack the Ripper was a particularly brilliant addition." Now, in an even more interesting twist, T-Side were not only taking on Shadow Man, but they were also starting pre-production on another Valiant comic to video game adaptation at the same time, which, as you can imagine, would cast a bit of a shadow on the entire studio. Yeah, so T-Side decided to take on the challenge of adapting 2 comic books simultaneously, with the idea being that the advancements and technology that the Shadow Man team were implementing could then be applied to the second project. So what was it? Magnus the robot fighter? Ninjak? If you are the one person who said Bloodshot, well, you're right. The chalky man that has a big red target on his chest and shoots guns. Bloodshot was targeted for the PlayStation, but Shadow Man was originally being designed for just the PC, as Acclaim felt they needed more exclusive product for that particular platform. With Turok 1 and 2's success on the Nintendo
Ultra 64.
Acclaim then suddenly backpedaled and decided to add it to T-Side's workload. This, of course, would require specialized technology to make sure the work being done on the PC could be scaled down and adapted so it would function on Nintendo's Fun Machine. These programming solutions would not easily transition over to the PlayStation to help with Bloodshot though, so that project was then left rudderless for quite a while, until it was eventually brought back behind a barn and Of course, with the PlayStation product now cancelled, Acclaim felt that would need to be made up elsewhere, which we'll get to in a little bit. Moving on, it was also then decided that a Dreamcast port might be wise, as the launch of Sega's final console will line up pretty well with Shadow Man's development schedule. Fortunately, Acclaim afforded T-Side extra time to get these ports up to snuff, as a ton of progress was being made on the PC version, to the point it was essentially done. This meant Acclaim purposely had T-Side sit on the finished game for an undetermined amount of time, until the N64 and Dreamcast versions had made enough progress that they could all release simultaneously. This obviously is a bit of a weird way to develop a game. Usually you have one studio or team working on the main targeted platform, and then one or more smaller teams doing all the port work. But I mean, this is Acclaim we're talking about. They wanted people to legally change their babies' names to Turok. Shadow Man's main designers were Simon Phipps and Guy Miller, who previously worked at Core, but Tomb Raider didn't exactly inform Shadow Man's design, as the inspiration on how to solve certain problems came from elsewhere, as confirmed by Jason Falkus. The success of Tomb Raider helped us appreciate the potential for such a game, but I would say the main inspirations were games such as Mario 64 and Zelda. These titles both utilized expanding 3D worlds, and we loved the way they were based around a central hub, and the world expanded as the player increased their abilities. Because of this, they were building all new tools and techniques while developing the game, which eventually culminated in their own custom engine they dubbed Vista, which would be able to render both multi-layered interiors, huge expansive exteriors, and seamlessly transition when going between both. They also wanted to prioritize a dynamic animation system which will let players shift different functions between both of Michael's hands, so he could swap between multiple different weapons in each, while climbing, jumping, or scaling ropes between both Earth and Deadside. So things were going pretty smoothly for the team when, just as the PC version was nearing completion, a real-life tragedy affected Shadow Man's development and essentially forced Acclaim to make some big decisions regarding the game. The Columbine Massacre, which took place in April of 1999, caused many politicians and other idiots to place blame on violent video games, and Acclaim was a main target, as its then CEO, Greg Fishback, was even summoned in front of a Senate hearing. Because of this, Acclaim were pressured to look at its upcoming slate of titles and make some edits, which included greatly toning down the general blood and gore that had originally been planned to flow pretty freely in Shadow Man's world. When this decision was made, however, it was very last minute, which caused a number of unintended bugs T-Side would have to scramble to fix. But that wasn't the only last-minute decision that Acclaim would make. Oh no, because this next one would have reverberations throughout the entire franchise. And since this is Acclaim, they would be for the worst. With the cancellation of Bloodshot, Acclaim wanted something else to make up for that missing slot, and thus a PlayStation version of Shadow Man was ordered, which didn't exactly thrill anyone at T-Side. We understood their reasoning. It was a big opportunity to get the game on the biggest platform, but it was a technical nightmare to execute, and we weren't very happy with the end result. One such example of said nightmare and the rush to get it out the door was T-Side having to make hasty cuts in several areas, as they were struggling to get the game even running on the PlayStation hardware. Of the 600 sound effects made for the game, only 90 made it into the PlayStation port, as there simply wasn't time to compress and implement them all, along with all the other technical headaches the team had to fix. So because of these and other shortcomings, the PlayStation version saw a significant bump down in review scores when compared to the other ports, and because this type of game was pretty common on the platform, that also contributed to the lowest sales of the bunch, at least according to the former staffers Retro Gamer spoke with. With this data in mind, it's curious then that Acclaim execs then made the decision that the hilariously named sequel, Shadow Man 2 Ekin Coming, should be a PlayStation 2 exclusive. Now, everyone knows the PS Double Ballin' was the absolute GOAT in terms of consoles sold, but it's still nevertheless quite odd that Acclaim ignored the GameCube, Xbox, and PC for literally no reason. Oh, except for the very big reason that Acclaim was quickly running out of money. Thanks to a string of early 2000s titles failing to reach their sales targets, all the money they had lost buying Valiant, losing big franchises like Mortal Kombat and others, and constant bad press by cringeworthy and expensive marketing stunts, which you can learn about in this video here, they most likely didn't want to spend money on additional ports, so it would be a safer bet to make just one version for the biggest platform, which I guess if you're penny pinching does make sense. The problem, though, is that with less money, T-Side had less time to innovate and make Shadow Man 2 something special, as its general gameplay and story were largely similar to the original. Coupled with that, by the time it was released in February of 2002, there were plenty of other similar games on the platform, so again, it was pretty soft on sales, as it, and pretty much everything Acclaim released at the time, yes, I'm looking at you BMX XXX, didn't help keep the lights on for much longer, as Acclaim declared bankruptcy just 2 years later. Sadly, T-Side went along with them, and even earlier than that, I'm afraid to say, as they were closed just a few months after the Second Coming's launch. Guy Miller would go on to write the story for Criterion's Black. Simon Phipps would land at Eurocom and lend his experience on the GoldenEye remake before taking a ride over to Three Fields Entertainment to get behind the wheel for the Burnout spiritual successors, Danger Zone and Dangerous Drive-In. As for the T-Side co-founders, the Felgus brothers, well, they founded Atomic Planet Entertainment, which, unfortunately are best known for developing a number of low-quality budget titles, like all those you see here. Now, normally, this would be the part of the video where I say, Shadow Man is dead and buried in his customized Shadow Man grave presented by Acclaim, but that's not the whole truth. The purveyors of some of the finest ports in the industry today, Night Dive put out an excellent and very improved remaster of the original Shadow Man, which even packed in previously cut content. So if you're looking to dip a toe into Deadside, I can't recommend that version enough. Now, normally this would be the part of the video where it's the end of the video, but as I was writing this, I said to myself, wait, wasn't there a new Shadow Man game announced, I think? And yeah, there was! Shadow Man Dark Legacy, based on one of his other comic book incarnations, was revealed by Valiant, which relaunched a few years back, and some company called Blowfish Studios, whom, to my recollection, has only put out one other game, Blackwind. Yeah, so nothing else has been revealed about Dark Legacy aside from a brief teaser, some environmental screenshots, and the promise of bloody, visceral action. But it's been about 1 year and 7 months with no word from either company, so I don't know. It's anyone's guess if this game will ever manage to creep out of the shadows. So, I will say that at least this is a slightly more positive ending than most of the episodes where I cover a older legacy franchise, as fortunately Shadow Man doesn't seem to be completely trapped in Deadside just yet. And if you know of any other terrifying tales of video game or movie development, shout them out in the comments below or enter the boggy haunted bayou that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Marvel's Avengers, featuring Squeenix and Crystal D, has to be the financial flop of 2020. Yes, even worse than Cyberpunk. As to why? Well, there's a multitude, hell, a multiverse amount of reasons for this, which, in a very rare case, is not due to the regular lineup of villainous villains we encounter here at What Happened. No disastrous engine switches, developer closures, or rogue variants mucking up the sacred timeline. Not one thing doomed this brawler/RPG/live service/single-player adventure, but rather, everything did. So grab your shield, your tattered purple pants, and your bow and arrow, I guess, cause it's time to find out what happened with Marvel's Avengers.
The Avengers!
As a refresher, the Avengers are not new to the realm of video gaming. There's of course the Cap-centric 90s arcade game, that terrible Ubisoft fighter literally no one remembers, and a cancelled THQ first-person shooter. But most famously of all, there's Galactic Storm.
Giant Man!
But ever since the MCU became the dominant force in the landscape of cinematique, there hadn't been a big, ambitious game to take advantage of the team's megastar status. Thus, in 2017, Square Enix, of all publishers, announced a collaboration with Marvel to produce several games based on its franchises, with Avengers obviously being the marquee one. First dubbed the Avengers Project, this announcement was met with, not much, as it was essentially just a logo and a temp name, and wasn't actually revealed in any concrete form for another 2 years. Before that, though, what Square did want fans to know was that the game would be primarily developed by Crystal Dynamics, best known for their blockbuster smash hits, Gex and Akuji the Heartless.
It's tail time.
Ever wonder why Shadow of the Tomb Raider was handled by Eidos Montreal and not the company that started the rebooted trilogy? Well, This is why. Crystal Dynamics would need all hands on deck because Avengers was going to be a massive undertaking that would require not only their sizable staff, but the staff from several other smaller studios. This, off the bat, was always going to lead to problems, as coordinating several companies across different time zones and language barriers is not something you just suddenly start doing and expect to excel at. And while Crystal Dynamics had collaborated before with other partners on multiplayer modes and additional maps for prior Tomb Raiders, something of this scale was a first for the team. This was acknowledged very early on by studio head Scott Amos. From our side, it's the biggest thing we've ever done. We now have 5 studios working together to pull this off. Crystal Dynamics at Redwood Shores. We opened a new studio in Bellevue called Crystal Northwest. We have our partners in the Netherlands, Nix's, Eidos Montreal, and even Square Enix Japan has folks from the tech group working with us. We've had to change how we work, how we are organized as a team, the number of people we need to do this, the number of external partners. We've had to go hire experts like Sean Escaig, who is our creative director. He told stories for Uncharted and The Last of Us. We needed him to help tell this story. Dave Fifield was a game director who worked on Halo and Call of Duty. We needed him to help us with multiplayer. We go around and look at what we need. Who are the experts? We cherry-picked the best of the best and said, let's put this together in a new way for something bigger than we've ever done. If that doesn't sound like a recipe to appear on the very show you're watching right now, I don't know what does. If you're working on your own IP that a singular studio or publisher owns, that certainly helps facilitate a smooth development cycle in terms of design and approval, which of course doesn't apply here. You're making a new game with some of the most well-loved comic book heroes of all time, and you got Square, Crystal Dynamics, Marvel, and all those other studios trying to hone in on what that game should be. So with that amount of cooks in the kitchen, it was always going to get a bit messy. The main development period lasted without any party giving anything away, and when it was finally shown in May of 2019 in its own media event, that close to the chest mentality continued. Despite the game getting its own mini E3, many basic key details were not shown, at least not publicly. Released footage consisted solely of cinematics, occasionally peppered with a snippet, a whisper of actual gameplay. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. Press were shown, not allowed to play, but shown the full opening level that showed off several Avengers. For whatever reason, Square or Marvel didn't want this footage going out to the public, and instead focused on the game's story, tone, and introducing the characters and their new looks. These new looks, as many of you know, induced the earliest, but certainly not the last, of many fan grumblings. While Sony and Insomniac's Spider-Man had made a conscious effort to distinguish itself from what was happening on cinema screens, Avengers was clearly embracing the MCU, as the core story was eerily similar to Infinity War/Endgame. There's an opening crisis that the Avengers fail to stop, followed by a 5-year gap, followed by the team having to regroup and pull together to stop a bigger threat, etc., etc. However, it still stopped short of committing to that continuity and aesthetic, i.e., they didn't want to pay any of the MCU actors for their likenesses or voices. Which I can't really blame them for. When the MCU started, that was affordable, but in 2020, it would have caused the game's already massive budget to balloon to something that would have made even Tony Stark blush. Alright, so these character designs, no need to beat a dead Beta Ray Bill here, but many complain that these designs simply looked like bottom-shelf facsimiles of said actors and actresses. Everyone here is depicted as legally distinct, the best type of distinct, to the real-life counterparts. That's not to disparage the incredible amount of voice and motion capture talent that was brought in, which was a veritable who's who of the VA industry. While there's some great performances in the game, it was very clear that Square wanted their MCU cake and to be able to eat it too. So this event, which showed very little gameplay, leading to many being confused about what the genre was even aiming for, was coupled with designs and story that felt like regurgitated cinematic concepts, made for a first impression that left many underwhelmed at worst and just whelmed at best.
A game where we as players can experience in both single player and co-op what it's like to be Earth's mightiest heroes.
Do I have any true believers in the house? Yes!
You get one shot at making a big splash, and Square and Marvel fumbled this showing right out of the gate, a fumbling that might have done even more long-term damage. Since they were being so hush-hush and were trying to control all imagery and media coming out of this debut, it wound up having the opposite effect. One individual at the show with a press pass wanted to fuck around and find out, so they shot a shaky cell phone video of gameplay, which of course does a disservice to most high-fidelity titles. Said footage was of course then leaked onto the internet, and the damage I hinted at earlier indeed was done. The power level of this villainous cell phone was off the charts. If Square and Marvel hadn't been so clandestine with this reveal, allowed direct capture, or showed off uncut gameplay, this is something that could have been avoided. Things didn't improve over the coming months as the powers that be slowly drip-fed new details and imagery, with conflicting messages that came from both the press and Square themselves. It started to circulate that the game had elements, or maybe actually was, the dreaded live service model that was already wearing out its welcome and was getting increasingly difficult to get a foothold in. You can have like 2 or 3 big games that serve that need, your Sieges, your Dead by Daylights, your Leagues, but there's just as many failures, your Fallout 76s, your Anthems, and your all these others. To put such a monumental amount of money, manpower, and money money into a live service model is always risky, especially when Crystal Dynamics had never done something like this before. But it's weird because unlike those aforementioned titles, Avengers wasn't a 100% dedicated live service title at all, but an awkward combination of a traditional single-player action game and an online co-op brawler with daily events, rewards, missions, and loot. But you'll be forgiven if at some point you never realize that, because it was a murky message that everyone involved failed to explain adequately. When you start Avengers campaign, you'll find several hours of what you'd expect, an Uncharted-like action movie filled with impressive set pieces, before midway through your adventure the game awkwardly shifts to a mission-based co-op suite that's only there to lube you up for all the live service fun it wants to give you. Now, since Avengers is a game very much still being made and employing hundreds of people, tea has yet to be spilled about the inner workings of its development. But given how the multiplayer is clumsily bolted halfway through the story campaign, means it was at least something that was implemented after the fact. Since Scott Amos admitted they needed to staff up with multiplayer experts, it's very possible that a simple single-player action adventure was initially designed, but then Square or Marvel or both wanted one more back-of-the-box feature. But it's that back-of-the-box feature that was the cause of so many headaches for Earth's mightiest heroes. For a game of this scale, with open, explorable levels, explosive set pieces, several complex characters, a single-player story, a full online multiplayer suite, and extensive DLC plans, meant there were a lot of working parts. Working parts that would be very prone to not working. When the public beta was released in August of 2020, people were understandably worried. As this beta went so poorly, even Bethesda were embarrassed for them. Bethesda, gotcha again. Any number of functionality bugs would occur at any given time. The game would randomly crash, just not connect players. It was cataclysmic in how poorly it went, although still not as bad as Heroes Reborn. In the weeks leading to this beta, major publications like GameSpot and others were finally able to speak freely about what Avengers actually was. A game with 2 halves. There's a story mode and a multiplayer mode. Think about that. It took a year and a half for Square and Marvel to finally confirm what the game was and how it worked.
Oh, right. Duh.
August was an important/disastrous month for the game for another reason, and that was the announcement that Marvel's most popular hero, Adam X the Extreme, Spider-Man, was going to be a PlayStation exclusive character. Now Matt, you scream, that's because Sony has the exclusive rights to Spider-Man video games. That makes sense. No, they don't own those rights. They always need to be worked out with Marvel on a game-by-game basis, so it's pretty clear Sony stepped in, wanted more people to play the game on PlayStation systems, and thus brokered a deal with the involved parties. When you have a multi-platform game, you're always going to piss off more people than you're going to please with a move like this. Many fans bemoan this anti-consumer practice, being denied a fan-favorite character just because Sony wanted to sell a few extra consoles. That was never gonna fly, or swing, or web swing. And all the online petitions or angry tweets in the world was never going to erase the ink on those contracts. So this is yet another decision that, while on paper seemed like a big money move, it just wound up being nothing but a tone-deaf misfire that only hurt the game from a PR perspective. And by this point, Avengers already had its fair share of black eyes and battle damage. Also, for those out there still keeping score, it's been almost a full year since Spidey's announcement, and there's been not a shred of the old web head. While we don't have the full reasons for this, part of the delay could most likely be attributed to the many bugs and issues found during the beta were indicative of a larger problem, because when COVID impacted the entire world, Avengers was being worked on by 5 different studios in 4 different countries, and at a critical phase of development. The majority of bug squashing obviously takes place in the last few months leading to release, and while games like this usually do suffer from rough launches, a global pandemic causing millions of businesses to rethink their work strategies and logistics obviously was a factor here. But even before that became an issue, please refer back to January of 2020, where Square announced Avengers was seeing a 5-month delay from May to September. And a delay like that means the game was already rife with instability and bugs. So if you combine that with a pandemic, you wind up with a patch that addresses over 1,000 bugs. Once the game was released in early September, the first major patch rolled out on the 19th, and scrolling down this list of fixes is just exhausting. It's like reading the Spider Clone Saga omnibus. I look at this list and I just grip my heart as it's currently trying to escape, and go out to all the QA testers and programmers that had to work their asses off to fix all these issues, because I'm aware of how many sleepless nights they would have had to endure. Really could have been avoided if Square and Marvel had just decided to push the game back by like another 3 months, maybe to January of 2021, would have done a lot in the long run. But because the game had already been delayed 5 months, I guess it was never an option.
Yeah, no.
And unfortunately, when someone that's on the fence about buying a game hears that its first patch fixes 1,000 issues, that's not a great look. What's a worse look, though, was the game's critical reception, which could charitably be described as lukewarm. While the game certainly had its positives with an entertaining, if predictable, single-player campaign, graphics, and overall production, its bugs, glacial grind to unlock moves, cosmetics, and gear, and its repetitive and lackluster endgame were huge knocks against it. Obviously, Square and Crystal Dynamics had a lot of work ahead of them, which threw their entire DLC roadmap out the proverbial window. Before launch, they had promised 1 character a month, which was something that just wasn't tenable, as they were currently embroiled in stomping out thousands of broodlings. So all these factors would then result in a game's player base obviously, being unhappy. But of course, a publisher doesn't really account for this. So when the DLC rollout did start, it wasn't exactly tailored to quell the tumult of disappointed fans. Kate Bishop arrived almost 3 months later in December, and while I have nothing against Kate, and many people don't, she wasn't exactly going to be putting butts in the seats. This was not made any better by another 3-month delay, which resulted in Hawkeye! Yeah. Again, while this isn't exactly their fault, it does come off as tone deaf. There's that term again. But fortunately, after Hawkeye, there was... nothing. That's it. As of the time of this writing, there's only been 2 completely original heroes added to this game. Yes, Black Panther is coming in the Wakanda expansion, but that's still 3 characters in 1 year. This was all exacerbated due to COVID delays, which led to more bugs, which led to pushing back the next-gen versions. This just impacted everything. Obviously, as time went on, bugs were fixed. The next-gen versions alleviated a lot of technical issues, but for every positive step forward, Square and Crystal Dynamics would cause it to take a step back. In March of this year, they announced that they would be increasing the grind to unlock moves and gear. They felt that due to bugs and design oversights, players were unlocking too much too fast, and that was ruining the pace of the game's economy.
Son of a...
They actually said in a public article that if players wanted to unlock stuff, they should now do so immediately before the changes were implemented. Literally everyone in the world disliked this. While they tried their best to reiterate and clarify with follow-up articles, it was too late. The mainstream player simply saw, we're making it even grindier, and there's no way to parse positive info from that. Finally, in the back of the parade of bad moves and misfires, Sean Escaig, the creative director of Avengers that had been put on a pedestal in early interviews and showings, suddenly quit Crystal Dynamics to go back to Naughty Dog, the company he left to join Crystal Dynamics for. Weirdly, there wasn't any communication or details from Square over this huge loss of staff. No farewell, no so long, good luck.
So that's it after 20 years. So long, good luck?
I don't recall saying good luck.
Also, it should be noted, while everyone praises this guy's work on The Last of Us or Uncharted, his real claim to fame is the co-director of...
With my skull.
Yeah! It's pretty evident with all this information that this shit isn't getting Realm reborn anytime soon, if at all. In fact, they're doubling down on what they do have. There's just too many companies and interests involved with this universe, and unlike Square, who has complete control over Final Fantasy, shutting it all down, going dark and rebooting months or even years later is simply not viable. They're gonna continue pushing forward, and to be fair, the Wakanda expansion is the biggest one yet, clocking in with 8 hours of story content, with Square and Marvel hoping that this will inch that needle over to the line of profitability. Oh yes, if I didn't mention that, as of the time of this video, profitability is something that Avengers still have not achieved. Despite selling over 3 million copies worldwide across all versions, the HD console game division of Square lost $68 million in the latter half of 2020 because of the game's performance, or lack thereof. And remember, Square has to spend more money on all these expansions and characters as they're made, but the game simply isn't performing well enough to support these efforts financially, so it's kind of a vicious circle where the game just never stops bleeding money. This is one of those projects that, while on the outset seemed like a slam dunk, a lot of decisions both from marketing and creative, plus pure old bad luck, resulted in something that really didn't live up to many people's expectations.
Disappointing.
It makes sense to have a catch-all live service game that lets you live out your superhero fantasies, please add She-Hulk, along with an almost limitless roster of characters, locations, and enemies, but we've seen that even the biggest franchises can fail to catch on, whether it's an MMO or live service thing. And while 3 million copies is nothing to scoff at, the game needs millions of active players on all the time, buying DLC and cosmetics every month, which is a good reason why this model doesn't always work.
You know, I made it for all the right reasons.
While it's still a bit early to claim that the game is dead or has zero future, it certainly is one example of the Avengers failing to assemble. Nuff said. If you know of any other video games or movies, cosmic, street level, or otherwise, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or enter the Flophouse VIP Tower and become a big boss and nominate what you'd like to see next. Excelsior, true believers, and thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to another face-slashing and multiverse-clashing episode of What Happened, the investigative YouTube-style pop culture media show that's covering a 15-year-old superhero film for absolutely no reason at all. Anyway, the current slate of Soup Cinema is in a very precarious position. Some things have pulled in good numbers and audience approval, while others simply have not. And really, this isn't too different from how things were back in the late 2000s. For every success, there was a commercial or critical not a success. An excellent example of the latter is our subject today, which focused on the origin story of everyone's favorite cigar-chomping, claw-popping, gene-lusting knucklehead, James Logan Howlett. An origin story whose critical backlash caused a chain of events that inexplicably are still being felt in 2024. So grab your best flannel shirt or yellow spandex as I answer the question, what happened to X-Men Origins Wolverine?
Today we're going to create Weapon X.
Obviously, the success of the X-Men films produced at 20th Century Fox emboldened the company to start theorizing how to squeeze even more blood out of the proverbial mutant stone. And of course, it was logical to start with the franchise's most popular hero. I mean, hell, kids were screaming at their parents to buy action figures of the scruffy little guy before the stores sold out. But while traditionally being just a member of a larger team, the plots of the first 3 X-Men films revolved heavily around Wolverine, which was absolutely 100% grade A authentic the style at the time. So the idea of Logan unquestionably being the central star wasn't too weird or risky, like, I don't know, greenlighting X-Men Origins Toad or something. However, even before X2 had released, a writer by the name of David I Helped Ruin Game of Thrones Benioff had tried convincing Fox execs to let him take a crack at writing a standalone Wolverine feature film, but it took until 2004 before he eventually got the job. Now, even though we're all aware of the final product's shortcomings, Benioff's original pitch was supposed to be a gritty, brutal take on the character, taking a lot of inspiration from Frank Miller's limited series, as well as Barry Windsor Smith's classic Weapon X storyline. As a sort of soft confirmation on this, in a 2004 interview with the website, that logo's a blast from the past, Benioff was asked if he could reveal anything about the story, to which he responded, "I'm not allowed to talk about it. Fox is pretty careful about that. It's not even totally finalized what story we are doing. What I can say is that in the X-Men movies we've seen a lot of the sweet Wolverine, so I think it's time to mess him up a little bit because all the fans know that he's the best there is at what he does, but what he does isn't very nice. Also, getting to write snicked in a comic book is the coolest thing." Of course, we didn't really get anything approaching even that vague description. Like so many movie-based what happened stories I've covered before, the powers that be didn't approve of the first draft. Hugh Jackman reportedly collaborated on this initial draft with Benioff, as it was supposed to be more of a personal character study, but evidently, that's not what Fox were looking for. These dueling desires over the script lasted for a few more years, and in the meantime, Jackman fulfilled his contract obligations by starring in that other X-Men movie, you know, the one that came after X2? I can't remember the name of it.
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
Right, yeah, that one. Big ups to My Way Entertainment, by the way.
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch. I'm gonna hit you with your own pimp.
So, when that film finished up being a critical disaster, Fox turned their attention back to Wolverine and hired another writer, Skip Woods, whose career at the time was absolutely room temperature, having just written Live Free or Die Hard and the Hitman movie, to rewrite Benioff's first draft. After that, David Suicide Squad Ayer was then brought in to contribute, and by the time the script was finally in a spot that Fox execs started liking, the 2008 writer's strike was looming, so they did the most logical thing: hired 2 more writers to try and make further last-minute changes before the strike started in earnest, which they apparently weren't able to do to everyone's 100% satisfaction. The first of these writers was James Vanderbilt, whose writing career has been full of peaks and valleys, having helped write The Rundown, Zodiac, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, the last 2 Scream movies, and the Independence Day sequel nobody saw. The other writer, Scott Silver, may not be as prolific, but has certainly made an impact in Hollywood, having worked on the scripts for 8 Mile, The Fighter, 2019's Joker, and the upcoming Joker pretentious subtitle. Now, what do you think you get when you've hired, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 writers who have all worked on vastly different films with contrasting tones and themes, and force them to quickly finish things up before a strike? Well, you get X-Men Origins Wolverine. Even though 20th Century Fox had thrown a small army of writers at it, Wolverine's script was still a little spotty and now barely resembled the somber personal origin story both Benioff and Jackman had originally wanted. One of, if not the most major change Fox had instituted and was confirmed by multiple sources, was the desire for this spin-off to then spawn more spin-offs, which meant multiple New Mutants would need to appear. The biggest of these was, of course, Gambit and Deadpool, whose own solo films were already being soft-planned by Fox, since their mutant status would mean they would fall under their deal with Marvel. In fact, Ryan Reynolds had teamed up with the writer of the Blade films, David S. Goyer, to start coming up with ideas for a Deadpool film back in 2003 under New Line Cinema. But once it was clear that the X-Men IP was staying at Fox, those plans were abandoned.
Great.
They instead started to focus on Blade Trinity while trying to lay down the groundwork for a potential Night Stalkers spin-off, which I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting for. It was David Benioff's task to incorporate Deadpool specifically, and in an old archived interview from Total Film, Jackman is quoted as saying the following, which has both aged well and rather poorly. I have to be very careful how I talk about Deadpool because it's something I'm really excited about in the movie, where it plays and how it plays. I just can't think right now how I can tell you about it without giving away some really cool ideas. That's where David Benioff was really smart, how coolly he brought the character in. The things I'm thinking about now, I don't want to tell you because the fans will go, "Aw, that's cool." Actually, some fans might be pissed off, but that's okay. I think they'll understand why we did it. We took some creative licenses with them. Oh, he was not wrong about that. Anyway, with the strike still ongoing at the start of 2008, Fox didn't want to wait, so they started searching for a director so they could get the cameras rolling. Potential candidates that already had experience with the X-Men, people such as Bryan Singer and Brett Ratner, as well as the Underworld and Live Free or Die Hard helmer Len Wiseman, expressed interest in the project. Hell, even Zack Snyder was approached to fill in the director's chair, but turned it down as he was preoccupied with Watchmen. who Fox eventually went with was somewhat of a dark horse. Gavin Hood had made a pretty significant name for himself with Sotsi, a co-production between the UK and South Africa that won the Academy Award in 2005 for Best International Film. He followed that up with his first major studio production, the political thriller Rendition, and he came away from that experience pretty positively, as by his own admission, New Line Cinema trusted him without constant oversight. That wasn't the case with Wolverine though. With a reported $150 million price tag, pressure from the writer's strike, and the hope this would launch the solo careers of other mutants, trouble began brewing almost immediately. As soon as filming kicked off in January of 2008, reports started filtering from the set and onto news sites saying Gavin Hood and Fox producers were posturing, snarling, and butting heads, much like Logan and his classic antagonist Victor Creed. So, between March and August of that year, you couldn't browse a movie set without hearing how Wolverine was struggling to get filmed due to the constant issues between Hood and Fox. The following comes from FirstShowing.net, who relayed a report that originally emanated from Hollywood Elsewhere. Apparently, we've got another case of a studio exec, Fox's Tom Rothman, trying to change a character to fit the widest possible audience, when the director, Gavin Hood, who knows what he's doing, has been shooting something they don't like. The story, as posted on Hollywood Elsewhere, discusses a huge set being used recently that, according to their source, was supposed to be on the dark, dingy, and somber side. This was Gavin Hood's choice as the director for the look of the set. But then Fox's Tom Rothman ordered them to repaint it, and Hood came back to find that it had been repainted top to bottom on Rothman's orders. This suggests that a creative tug-of-war is going on, and that Rothman, one can reasonably gather, feels a certain managerial/territorial investment in the X-Men franchise. And that's just one of the reports, so yeah, a tale as old as time. A director trying to create a specific vision that's true to the source material, while an executive wants to make changes they feel will make the film the most profitable it can be.
We did it. We did it.
Well, that's a common occurrence in a lot of big movie sets. What is far less common is not having writers available to help tweak scenes or smooth out dialogue. For the first full month and a half of filming, the crew were still working with an unfinished script, and it was only until mid-February, when the writer's strike was over, that Fox ordered rewrites of specific scenes, so new pages were now being added almost daily, causing more delays and frustrations for the actors and director. One of these changes that frustrated Gavin Hood specifically was the fact that Fox wanted to greatly tone down any scenes where Wolverine was supposed to be grappling with grief, guilt, and PTSD, and probably replace those scenes with ones where Wolverine doesn't look at explosions. Unfortunately, these wouldn't be the only villainous forces X-Men Origins would have to contend with, as ongoing arguments, possible director replacement schemes, and the film being leaked online were still about to bear their claws. Hood and Fox's bickering became so intense over the course of 2008 that the studio decided to initiate backup plans in case they needed to break glass and boot Hood from the project. According to an article on Variety, this plan to possibly replace Hood was going to be extremely sneaky. Wolverine helmer Gavin Hood was nearly fired, according to sources, because of squabbles with the studio, and two backup directors were in place before Richard Donner, who is married to the film's producer Lauren Schuler Donner, flew to the Australian set to smooth things over. At the time, Fox insisted that Richard Donner was on set because he is a producer on the film. However, current credits for the film list various producers, but Donner is not one of them. Now, this is just speculation on my behalf, but it seems this might have been part of a two-pronged plan. If the late Richard Donner had not been able to quell tensions and Hood was sent packing or quit, they would then insert those backup directors, or Donner himself would simply step in to finish the film, or at the very least would help find someone who could. Cooler heads prevailed though, and Gavin Hood stayed on until the end of production. Although really, at what cost? X-Men Origins Wolverine had suffered bad press all throughout 2008, with Jackman's smiling assurances during that year's Comic-Con not doing all that much to instill confidence. And what confidence there was absolutely annihilated a short time later. In March of 2009, 2 months ahead of Wolverine's May release date, a full-length DVD-quality work print of the film was spread across the internet, uploaded by a single individual who had reportedly bought the work print from a local merchant in New York City. Even though Fox got it scrubbed from most sites in the first 24 hours, the damage was done and had already been downloaded millions of times, at least 4.5 by Fox's count at the time.
That leak had a higher Rotten Tomatoes score, which was shocking given that it was, blue screens and ropes and...
A hilarious side note to this though, a movie blogger who worked for Fox News wrote a full review of the leaked work print, talked shit about how easy it was to download, and of course, parted ways with Fox shortly thereafter. Like, bro, what the hell were you thinking?
I'm trying to get fired.
So, with all that said, it should be no surprise that with all the studio interference, the contrasting writing styles, the last-minute revisions, bad early word of mouth from the work print, and everything else, that no amount of healing factor was going to repair the damage from the critical thrashing X-Men Origins Wolverine suffered. It still proudly stands as the second lowest rated X-Men film of all time, right behind the unwatchable dreck that is Dark Phoenix. Man, I should take a crack at that one someday. Commercially, though, X-Men Origins did make $375 million on a budget of $150, which is pretty typical for a successful superhero film at that time, but trailed far, far behind the likes of The Dark Knight or the first Iron Man. It was enough, of course, to still greenlight a sequel, the marginally better The Wolverine, and at least that wound up giving us the brilliant Logan, which seemed like the tone that Benioff, Jackman, and Hood originally wanted. Speaking of, Hood doesn't look back on his first and only foray into superhero cinema as negatively as you'd think, saying to a crowd before a screening of one of his later films, "I'm very grateful because I managed to buy a house off that film, so don't get me wrong. I own the mistakes I made. I learned a great deal." So, while X-Men Origins Wolverine fared well enough to get its own sequels, most of the spin-offs Fox execs were wanking off to were never developed. There was supposed to be X-Men Origins Magneto, a Gambit solo film that was really close to being made, an X-Force spin-off, and of course a Ryan Reynolds-led Deadpool project. And all were either cancelled, never even started, or heavily retooled. For example, it took a further 5 years and Ryan Reynolds' famous test footage before Fox finally took the Merc with the Mouse seriously and allowed a weird, violent X-Men film to be made and, actually be accurate to the character. It remains to be seen if Deadpool and Wolverine will give the superhero genre the shot in the arm it desperately needs. I'm writing this weeks in advance, of course, but it can't be any worse than the last time these two characters shared the screen, which of course gave us this Slender Man Baraka nightmare that I wish we could all remove from our collective consciousness. If you know of any other monstrously moronic mutant-based misfires, let me know in the comments below or enter the danger room that is my social media. See you next time, bub, and thanks for watching! Hello and welcome to another episode of What Happened, where I am dispensing with the usual intro due to the remote control device in the back of my skull that will go off if I take too long. Thanks, Waller. So do let me get straight to it. Warner Bros. Games and Rocksteady Studios' latest effort is a title that, from the time of its announcement to its eventual release, wasn't exactly desired by a hefty chunk of Batman fans, with one of the main reasons being, it's not a Batman game. But for a multitude of reasons that we'll be getting into, WB went forward with The Squad anyhow. In fact, they tried several times to go forward with the idea of a violent cooperative supervillain team game over the course of 14 years. And nothing, not the pleas of fans, nor multiple delays, snags, problems, and sudden departures was ever going to change that. So grab your mallets, boomerangs, various laser-firing artillery, and tons of Battle Pass exclusive gear as I answer the question, what happened to Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League? I can tell you this for free, there's a lot of backstory to this one, like an obscene amount of backstory, so let's just dive bomb right into it. After Rocksteady's Arkham Knight released back in 2015, which did psychic damage, was almost a decade ago, fans started to wonder what was taking so long for the highly respected London-based studio to announce their next big project. Some of you out there, however, may remember they were busy for another year or so developing the unmemorable Batman Arkham VR. This is important to our story because it meant that WB's plans to push the Suicide Squad had to fall to someone else, at least at that time. That someone else would be WB Games Montreal, who are best known as the developers of the red-headed stepchild of the Arkhamverse, Arkham Origins. It's literally in its name. To this day, I don't know why this prequel is intentionally ignored and never included in remasters or re-releases, but yeah, it is what it is, I guess. Anyway, once WB Montreal completed Origins and its DLC, their main staff moved on to their next unannounced project, which then caused, outside of some support work for other WB-owned studios, a huge gap in their work history. This unannounced project was in fact a Suicide Squad game, which, while was never made official, has had enough evidence linked to it over the years to safely confirm. There was, of course, Warner Brothers' push to start developing a film to hopefully make this team of unbalanced ne'er-do-wells a household name. Then there was the fact that both Arkham Origins and its companion game, Blackgate, imply that the Squad were going to be throwing their, kooky, deranged hats into the video game ring, although these hints would feature some characters that wouldn't actually appear in the released product, or at least not yet, maybe, I don't know. But honestly, before all that, I mean, that's not even where all this technically begins, because even though WB Montreal started working on Suicide Squad in earnest in late 2013, maybe early 2014, to coincide with the in-development movie, the origins of the game start all the way back to 2010. Yeah, you heard that right. Former DC Entertainment Chief Creative Officer Jeff Johns said in a San Diego Comic-Con panel that a hardcore violent Suicide Squad video game was in development, but provided no details other than that. Now, WB Montreal was only just founded in 2010, so it might be that the project actually started up at a completely different studio, or it had just kicked off pre-production in Montreal by a much smaller team, while the majority of the workforce focused on Arkham Origins. If I was a betting skeleton man, I think it's more likely the latter, because Mr. Johns dropped more hints that such a game was still in development in 2012, which moves it closer to when WB Montreal would be available, but we can't be absolutely sure. I did reach out to 2 former staff members who were at the studio during that relevant time period, but their only comment was sadly, no comment, and get used to that, by the way. And really, despite the facts that we do have, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a third studio in the mix at some point. I mean, hell, even in 2024, we just found out that Monolith had been working on an open-world Nolanverse game that featured the first implementation of their Nemesis system. So yeah, crazier shit has happened, and crazier shit will indeed continue. What we do know for sure is that WB Montreal's main team moved on to Suicide Squad, but like most AAA studios, they also had another smaller team doing pre-production on their next project, that being a Batman title starring Damian Wayne in a crumbling dystopian Gotham City, which we'll get to in a bit. It's now roughly 2016, and David Ayer's cinematic adaptation of the Suicide Squad released to a very divisive, i.e. negative critical backlash due to a multiverse of reasons that it actually might need its own What Happened story someday. Although I really don't want to. Anyway, once the fallout from the film started leveling off, reports began popping up that WB tongue cluckers and beard strokers had decided to detonate the bomb that was lodged deep within their Montreal studio, unaliving their would-be team of villains. Now, this cancellation might have had something to do with the primarily negative reception to the film or any number of other outside factors, but the only confirmed one was what various outlets reported on, which was that WB execs were not impressed with what the Montreal team had produced, and apparently that was enough to axe the whole thing. This is where we finally make the connection back to Rocksteady, as the Suicide Squad concept was then shifted over to them, which we'll get to in a second, I swear, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least finish up with WB Montreal. With their main in-development project now snatched away, they then shifted to their secondary one, the aforementioned Damian Wayne concept, which was known under the temp working title of Project Sabbath. Somewhat ironically, it was reported, along with a whole bunch of other stuff, that it was going to use the Nemesis system that Monolith had repurposed from their canceled Batman game and into Shadow of Mordor. Yo, big ups to my boy Garl the Drunk, I love you, baby. It was in 2019, however, that this information, along with the general plot, cast of characters, and a significant amount of concept art, mysteriously leaked onto the internet, but by the time it had, Sabbath was already long dead. It seems sometime between 2016 and 2018, Damian Wayne's cape and cowl were ripped away, and perhaps incorporating the co-op/multiplayer work they had started with Suicide Squad, Sabbath turned into what we know today as Gotham Knights. It's very common for studios to not just throw away good designs and code, and instead find ways to repurpose them for other projects, and that's really likely what happened here, although I can't 100% confirm it. Again, the former staff members I reached out to remain tight-lipped on this, but if you look at the timeline, well, it really works out, especially when you consider when Gotham Knights was publicly revealed. Related to this, earlier this year, the legendary Josh Keaton said in a live stream he had done several recording sessions as Damian Wayne, which shows just how far along the game really was. He also revealed it was not an Arkhamverse title, and theorized that the reason the entire project fell apart and was cancelled was because of the leaks. Now, no disrespect to the man, but that doesn't really make sense logistically, because the leaks only happened in 2019, and Gotham Knights was unveiled in 2020, so the cancellation, or perhaps the transition into a very different open-world co-op game, had to have happened well before that. It also doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint, because why would a publisher just cancel a game because some details of it got leaked? Like, games leak out all the time. Anyway, during all of this, Rocksteady had their own shit going on. According to reports, they were working on a multiplayer project that may or may not have been a completely new, all-original IP. The other thing they were working on, according to the internet at large, was the fabled Superman game. The Last Son of Krypton has had one of the worst streaks of stinkers in video game history, as pretty much every solo game he's ever had isn't really worth having. And yeah, I know this sucks to say, but I'm counting Death and Returns in there too. It's just disappointing, you know? Just really repetitive, drawn out, kind of boring, and the mechanic... Anyway, the rumors of Rocksteady working on a game starring the Man of Steel wouldn't seem to die, even though they were just that, rumors. According to a Bloomberg report from earlier this year, Rocksteady basically confirmed a Soups game was never worked on or ever even pitched, so as far as I can tell, this was just a lot of wishful whispers. Moving on, their mysterious multiplayer project seemed to go nowhere, or perhaps again the work done on it might have been adapted to support the Suicide Squad, but I couldn't find confirmation on that either. Remember the no comment I got from the WB Montreal employees? Well, that goes doubly so with most of the former Rocksteadyers I also contacted. As you can imagine, since Kill the Justice League is just a few months old, and WB being a pretty litigious and, let's be honest, miserly company, I didn't expect many people willing to dish out industry secrets. There was, however, one anonymous source I spoke to that did give me a shred of insight into Suicide Squad once it had shifted over to Rocksteady. They revealed that the game's development was put on pause while story rewrites were happening in the background, which of course would have slowed things down across several disciplines. While they weren't able to provide details on what these story changes were, considering all we've learned so far, it could have been literally anything. If I was to hazard a guess though, it may have been due to complications surrounding the next Suicide Squad film, which went through several writers and directors all throughout 2016 to late 2018, which in turn kept pushing back the release date and could have possibly affected other Suicide Squad projects. My source also cited two other things that may have accounted for the multiple delays: high employee turnover and getting acclimated to the games-as-a-service development pipeline. My source wanted it to be noted that this high turnover was not due to dissatisfaction within Rocksteady, but rather the AAA game dev environment in London, which they described as very competitive. Senior employees were often getting headhunted and offered way more money to join other studios, and while a number of them would take up these deals, they would either get dissatisfied with these new positions or suddenly be laid off and return to Rocksteady once again. Related to that, Rocksteady upper management also had to hire a consultant with expertise in games-as-a-service development to evangelize the team and get them educated on everything an online action co-op RPG had to offer, as at the time that's where the industry looked like it was heading. The only other thing I can confidently put forward, though, is that developing Suicide Squad was undoubtedly a technical nightmare, as Rocksteady, talented as they may be, hadn't really tackled anything with the level of scope and complexity that many modern online games tend to offer. When they started working on the Arkham trilogy, they ramped up their development and ambition in smooth and logical ways. Tightly designed, interconnected biomes with clever and detailed level designs, expanding out into an open world that was conservative in scope while still offering plenty to do and explore, and finally adapting that city to support a large vehicle for players to traverse the map, while turning the graphical fidelity up to 12. So going from that to having to design the very architecturally different Metropolis and gameplay loop that has to work with 4 players killing dozens of enemies online across multiple platforms, as well as stuffing as many different modifiers, stats, weapons, gear, microtransactions, and DLC as the cackling corpse-like WB corporate fat cats wanted, well, I'm sure it was a very stressful few years. And unfortunately, all that effort and stress would all be for naught. When Rocksteady finally did announce Kill the Justice League at the August 2020 edition of WB's short-lived DC fandom event, there was of course much grumbling from fans. It had been 6 years since there had been a traditional single-player Batman game, and after the fandom event, it seemed like WB and its associated studios were making anything but that. This is because they didn't announce 1, but 2 titles that put a heavy focus on co-op multiplayer that were all about stats, loot, season passes, and not controlling Batman. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Why on earth would they greenlight 2 of these things when the Square Enix and Crystal Dynamics live service Avengers game flopped so horribly? Well, time makes fools of us all, because that wasn't even out yet. The fandom event was held in August, while Avengers failed to assemble the following October. But what about much later, like when the Avengers player count started to suddenly dip? Well, when you're knee-deep in AAA development and millions upon millions of dollars and years upon years of work are at stake, when something gets publicly announced, in 99% of cases, it's far too late to pivot or backpedal. The following has been said lots of times, and I'm gonna say it again, but when something becomes hot like Fortnite or Destiny, lots of publishers start rubbing their hands together going, oh, this is the new hot shit, let's do that. But given the prolonged nature of video game development, by the time they actually release their version of that popular thing, it's far, far too late, and they often end up failing in spectacular and embarrassing ways. Suicide Squad did have one saving grace during its first big reveal though, and that was the fact that its first trailer was all CGI and bereft of any real gameplay, so for a sizable chunk of fans, the benefit of the doubt was being given. Sure, this clearly wasn't the shiny next-gen Batman sequel from a series that had sold over 30 million units worldwide, but, well, it was still rock steady, and they had a proven track record. However, that same track record would be tarnished that same month, when a report began to circulate that, back in 2018, 10 of Rocksteady's 16 female employees signed a letter of complaint to the studio heads, citing a toxic work environment that fostered sexual harassment, demeaning comments, and various other forms of abuse. This scathing report would go on to reveal that Rocksteady did very little to reprimand or correct the behavior aside from a single 1-hour seminar on proper workplace etiquette. Once this story broke out, Rocksteady management did confirm that the 2018 letter of complaint had been filed, but contrary to the new report, said they did take extensive measures to fix these issues. One female employee wound up quitting the company altogether and asked for Rocksteady management to remove her name from the credits of Suicide Squad, as she no longer wanted to be associated with the studio. Clearly, though, things were not running all that smoothly, and this controversy wasn't going to be the only one, as it then seemed to set off a chain reaction of negative headlines, massive delays, fan backlash, and 2 high-profile and very sudden exits. During the fandom event, Suicide Squad was given a loose 2022 launch window, but come March of 2022, they still hadn't narrowed that down. Unfortunately, when Rocksteady did share news about the release date, they admitted it was going to shift. By a lot, namely skipping the entire year altogether and moving into another nebulous early 2023. The reason given, of course, was the usual, want to deliver the best quality project, thank you for your patience, yada yada yada. And don't get me wrong, that's a good thing. I mean, I shudder to think of the product that would have been released if WB had insisted on a 2022 launch. That wasn't, however, going to be the only delay. Far from it. Just a few months later at the 2022 Please Wrap It Up Awards, this early 2023 date then shifted slightly again to mid-2023, May 26 to be precise. It would also include the special mention that it would be Kevin Conroy's last time portraying Batman, as he sadly passed away the month earlier. RIP to a legend. The bad shit, though, really hit the fan during the February 2023 State of Play event, where an extended gameplay sequence was shown of the Suicide Squad bouncing around Metropolis, talking incessantly and shooting guns and lasers at brightly colored things. During this long presentation and the subsequent FAQ that was posted online afterwards, Rocksteady confirmed the fears of many fans. Suicide Squad would need a constant internet connection to play, would have an elaborate battle pass, and would consistently offer new downloadable gear, weapons, costumes, and characters on top of that, much like, you guessed it, the Avengers game. Funnily enough, around the time this State of Play aired online, it was announced that Avengers would no longer longer be receiving any new content or characters, as Crystal Dynamics was now moving on to other projects. Yeah, not at all a red flag, is it, WB? The response to this new gameplay trailer and all that horrible stuff I mentioned didn't go down well, and was met with plenty of vitriol from many fans who just wanted a good narrative-based single-player superhero game, something that, outside of a few key examples, seemed to be getting rarer and rarer. Now, at the time this trailer aired, Kill the Justice League was still slotted in as a May 2023 release, so it took many by surprise that just 1 month before that, Rocksteady decided to pump the brakes and announce another massive delay, this time to February 2nd, 2024. Just going by the dozens of other examples we've seen in the past, this was, in all likelihood, a delay designed to fix massive amounts of bugs and technical issues that the team just weren't able to crack in time, because despite the many complaints fans lobbied at the State of Play reveal, nothing about Kill the Justice League's in-game economy or gameplay style would wind up changing. The official reason for this next mammoth delay was pretty much the same one they said last time. We have made the tough but necessary decision to take the time needed to work on getting the game to be the best quality experience for players. Thank you for our amazing community for the continued support, patience, and understanding. There is much more to share in the months ahead, and we look forward to seeing you in Metropolis next year. Now, some fans, the most sweet, innocent, and naive ones, mind you, took this delay as a good sign. Rocksteady had to know players were not happy about, well, a lot of stuff, so there was some hope that this delay was not only for polishing, but by taking consumer feedback into consideration and an extensive bout of retooling. But, as I outlined earlier, this just wasn't going to be the reality. There was no way, with WB at the helm at least, that Suicide Squad's entire in-game economy / scam was going to be redesigned, and there was even more no way that the gameplay or mechanics would change either, as it was just simply too late for that. Remember, the game was nearing 2 years behind schedule already, and honestly, in my opinion, the only reason it wasn't squirted out sooner at WB's insistence was probably Rocksteady's pedigree and pushback from its founders. While I've covered plenty of stories here on what happened where a publisher does take a step back, looks at a near completed project and says, this isn't working, let's just cut our losses before we lose even more money and cancel the whole damn thing. Now, while WB Discovery's movie division seems to be all about that shitty life, it's slightly different for video games. Nowadays, years upon years of more work, and in many cases, way more money gets poured into AAA gaming over, say, a movie, depending on its scope, but the ceiling for profits can sometimes be even higher. Also, you'll notice that most of the near-finished games I've covered before were from earlier generations, where budgets were significantly smaller than they are today. So, in summary, I guess, by this point, after so many false starts and canceled pitches by multiple studios dating back to 2010, shifting over to their premier developer in full production for at least 5 years and promoted for 2 of them, there was no way WB was going to cancel or delay Suicide Squad any longer. The hype machine had to start spinning, but it was going to be, and stay, a very uphill battle. Quite frankly, the press did not sugarcoat this situation, as online previews of Suicide Squad from an event in January 2024, just a few weeks away from launch, were largely negative, as many outlets cited uncertainty about pretty much everything. Journalists and reviewers took issue with the now familiar grindy nature of the gameplay, the messy UI, the technical performance, previews tend to be pretty optimistic at the very least, but this time no one was pulling their punches. And it has to be said that while a good portion of this negativity was due to the game itself, burnout from this particular subgenre must have been a factor too, as fans and journalists have experienced this same type of gameplay loop pretty regularly for the last few years, including, superhero-based least ones. And with all of the big, hot, hardcore gaming season titles I've covered here on What Happened, I've never seen the usually glowing early previews be less than glowing. At least CD Projekt Red had the foresight to only allow coverage of the PC version of Cyberpunk, and Rockstar allowed no previews at all of the GTA Definitive Collection shit show. So really, the numbers did not lie, and they spelled disaster for Rocksteady and Warner Brothers at sacred release day. And so, a disaster it indeed was. Suicide Squad's launch was plagued with a litany of problems, bugs, and backlash. As a part of the deluxe edition, players were given 72 hours of early access to the game, but because of a bizarre issue that marked players' progress as 100% complete before even booting it up, servers had to be taken down for maintenance to fix the boo-boo. And since it's an online-only game, no one was able to play it during that downtime, which, as you can imagine, made many gamers happy. Those affected were given a 2,000 Luther bucks, which equated to around $20 of real-world currencies. So, yeah, not off to a good start. Of course, the game's online connectivity in general was also a big problem, as even weeks after launch, Rocksteady were still trying to crack down on issues that were causing players to desync or get booted from a session altogether. Subsequent patches actually made things worse for some players, as they weren't able to properly level their characters or gear, while others would run into the infamous loading Metropolis bug, which wouldn't let players progress at all. Because of all of this, the community for the game, even some of its staunchest and most brave defenders, started turning against it, citing immense dissatisfaction with all these bugs, the prospect of having to kill and not play as some of their favorite heroes, but of course the monetization model as well. It's bad enough when the fully priced game you paid for lacks basic functionality, but it's another thing when that fully priced game you paid for that's not working is also constantly trying to incentivize you to spend your money. It should be no surprise then that Kill the Justice League's aggregate review scores placed it lower than both Avengers and Gotham Knights, and as the issues and bad press began to pile up, its player count drastically went down. But to some publishers, critical reception can sometimes be a little less of an important factor when compared to commercial reception, and fortunately, in respect to Suicide Squad, that actually wasn't the case. It just barely made the top 10 of the best-selling games of February 2024 according to NPD numbers, being beaten out by the likes of 2023's Madden release, Tekken 8, FF7 Rebirth, and Helldivers 2. In slightly better but still worse news, Suicide Squad was the #1 game in the UK during the first few days of its launch, but fell to 3rd the next week and then 13th the week after that. While player counts are hard to track across all platforms, Steam numbers paint a pretty grim picture. When the game launched, it peaked at around 13,000 players, which then nosedived into 3 digits by the end of February. And as of the time of this writing, it regularly varies between 300 to 400 players. Now, okay, during all these trials and tribulations, something that certainly could have helped was strong, experienced leadership. Leadership who could rally the team, take decisive action, and work towards bettering the product in a timely manner. Unfortunately, that precise type of experience wasn't really available to Suicide Squad's developers during its launch, as the founders of Rocksteady, who had led on all their games up to that point, had left the studio, and had left the studio for a while. Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill, in a joint statement with Warner Brothers, explained that they were leaving after 18 years, with the reason being as vague as you'd expect. With Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League nearly finished, they have both decided to leave Rocksteady at the end of 2022 and will begin a new adventure in gaming. Now, it's typical that towards the end of a given project, some creative leads feel that their job is done, so they decide to seek new challenges elsewhere. The problem is, like he was on all of Rocksteady's Arkham games, Sefton Hill was Suicide Squad's creative director, and if you check your dates, his departure was not just 2 to 3 months before launch, but rather over a full year. Jamie Walker's departure wasn't insignificant either, because while he didn't work on most games directly in a creative sense, he was Rocksteady's studio director, so he was at the head of its daily operations. Now, obviously, when these two exits were planned and then announced, Suicide Squad was still on track for its early 2023 release, but then it got delayed the full year to 2024, and the studio was now without 2 of its key people. It's not exactly known what prompted the sudden exit, if there was any other factors aside from the official reason. And try to act surprised here, I wasn't able to contact either Mr. Walker or Mr. Hill in time for this video. Honestly, just like many elements to Suicide Squad's very messy development, there could be a multitude of reasons for their departure. Perhaps they did feel the game was in good hands and simply didn't think a big delay was forthcoming. Perhaps they were tired of working under the WB umbrella or were not supportive of the games as a service business model that was being pushed. Or perhaps they, as the figureheads and leaders of Rocksteady's work culture, were given a diplomatic way to quietly exit the studio. Regardless of the reason, both Hill and Walker announced earlier this year they were opening another London-based studio called 100 Star Games, and would be focusing on, yet again, the AAA gaming space. Meanwhile, Warner Brothers execs had their own announcement in regards to Suicide Squad, and it wasn't nearly as positive. IGN was the first to report that in an earnings call, WB Discovery's CFO simply said, "This year, Suicide Squad, one of our key video game releases in 2024, has fallen short of our expectations since its release earlier in the quarter, setting our games business up for a tough year-over-year comp in Q1. And things do seem like they're gonna remain tough, at least, for a while." Despite recently released Joker content, the Clown Prince of Crime doesn't seem to be moving the needle much at all, and at this point, many don't believe it ever will. While turnarounds aren't unheard of, cut to the only 2 examples we really have, it's difficult seeing Kill the Justice League somehow reverse its fortunes anytime soon, or ever, really. You can pinpoint a lot of these poor decisions on upper management in some way or another, and while hindsight is indeed 2020, it's nevertheless easy to see where the better paths were not taken. Letting WB Montreal continue their version of Suicide Squad and letting Rocksteady cook, allowing the single-player Damian Wayne game to continue, Gotham Knights being the IP to shift over to Rocksteady instead of Suicide Squad, or maybe not wasting everyone's time with another grindy live service title when there's more than enough to go around. But sadly, the most mystifying thing of all is WB's recent proclamation that not only were they going to continue live servicey games, they were going to double down on them. As reported by GameSpot, during a Morgan Stanley Billionaires Circle Jerk event, the head of WB Games, J.B. Perrette, said, "So rather than just launching a kind of one-on-one console game, how do we develop a game around, for example, Harry Potter that is a live service, where people can continue to live and work and build and play in that world on an ongoing basis. We have a roadmap and a strategic investment plan to try and build out that business, and we think there is meaningful growth over the course of the next couple of years. It's not just expanding the longevity in the life cycle so that you're not going from a release of a Batman title 1 year and then sort of it goes dormant for 3 or 4 years. If we can execute on this strategy, it also allows that franchise to live on day to day, week to week, on a much more consistent basis. So you're nurturing that fan base." No, you're not! It was literally proved. You proved that you can't just bolt on this model to anything and everything and expect success. Like, this interview happened a full month after Suicide Squad bombed and years after the Avengers did. Like what the fuck is wrong with you? Statements like this, thinking like this, proves that Some men just want to watch the world burn. Let's just hope Rocksteady somehow survives this debacle. But in the meantime, if you out there know of any other cursed comic book capers, let me know in the comments below or enter whatever that the Suicide Squad hangs out in place. That is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching. Welcome back to another bullseye punching and cross-clutching episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that regularly pings the darkest and dankest of alleyways for the most troubling stories in video game and movie development. And when you say troubled, it doesn't take long for the 2003 version of Daredevil to enter your mind, as it was considered a mopey misfire in the wake of other massively successful superhero fare like X-Men 1 and 2, and of course, Sam Raimi's The Human Spider.
The Human Spider, that's it? That's the best you got?
Yeah.
Oh, that sucks.
And while The Man Without Fear's film debut starred several high-profile actors, a lean budget, and didn't have much in the way of competition on its opening weekend, it still garnered tepid reviews from both critics and fans, and therefore failed to become the start of the, Hell's Kitchen cinematic universe that its distributor, 20th Century Fox, were looking for. It's a story of good intentions, tonal changes, and a whole lot of material that was cut to shreds in the editing room.
To shreds, you say?
So grab your billy club and your tightest, reddest leather as I answer the question, what happened to Daredevil 2003?
Hey, come on, I got a blind guy here.
No. The blind lawyer from Hell's Kitchen.
When it awkwardly jumped and tumbled into playgrounds, cineplexes on Valentine's Day 22 years ago, Daredevil actually started development in the late 1990s, when Marvel was so bankrupt that they started selling the cinematic rights to their characters out of the back of an old van. Blind lawyer turned vigilante Matt Murdock happened to be one of these heroes, but after a failed attempt to get the film set up at 20th Century Fox with Christopher Columbus in talks to direct, the project then moved on to Columbia Pictures, where it also failed to make any headway until a full and very complete cancellation in 1999. During that last attempt at Columbia, Mark Steven Johnson, who cut his teeth in writing lighter materials such as Grumpy Old Men, Big Bully, never heard of that one before, and the cinematic tour de force that was Jack Frost.
Really fucking frosty?
No, not that Jack Frost. The Michael Keaton one?
Sometimes it's good to have a big butt.
Yeah, that's the one. Well, Mr. Johnson became obsessed with the character through Kevin Smith's and Frank Miller's respective runs on the comic book. He championed his story treatment with the hope that he would be hired to write the final script, wanting to deliver a dark, gritty, hard-boiled take much in the same vein as 1994's The Crow, or even more appropriately, 1998's Blade.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
In an interview with Yahoo Entertainment back in 2023, Mark regaled how getting studios and producers interested in superhero stories back then was still exceedingly difficult, even in a post-X-Men landscape. It was such a different world then. It's funny, we were developing Daredevil before the first Spider-Man came out, and I remember people saying to me, "I don't think that movie's gonna work." I was like, why? Spider-Man is one of the greatest characters. And they said, well, you can't see his face. I remember telling people I was going to do Daredevil, and they would say to me, you mean Evel Knievel? I'd explain, no, he's a blind lawyer who has superpowers and heightened senses, and he puts on a devil costume to fight crime. And they'd be like, oh, so it's a comedy. Nobody knew who the character was back then. But when Spider-Man did swing into theaters and broke all kinds of records, every studio started hooting and a-hollering for more masked and caped adventurers. And in a not much of a shocking twist, 20th Century Fox came crawling back to the character they had dismissed several years earlier.
Bobby, man, nobody wouldn't touch me with a 20,000-foot pole, man. I feel you.
Mark Steven Johnson was retained as the writer, with his original script being touted by news outlets and even Kevin Feige, who was a VP under Avi Arad at the time, as one of the best they had ever read, as it was largely inspired by Frank Miller's Born Again storyline. Mr. Johnson was even able to snag the coveted director's chair as well, as it wasn't particularly expensive to hire him since he didn't have a whole lot of experience, having only helmed the forgettable tearjerker Simon Birch back in '98. Still though, the movie was finally being made, and with the early buzz from the script and the support of such important figures as Kevin Smith and then Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Joe Quesada, it seemed like Daredevil was going to be another blockbuster to continue Marvel's hot streak. But like in so many other What Happened episodes I've done before, you can never underestimate the sheer incompetence and unending boobery of meddling producers and executives. Of course, every superhero film needs an appropriate cast. And if you can't find someone that can totally live and breathe the character, then you at least need hot and upcoming stars with marquee value, and Daredevil definitely prioritized the latter. In the interview with Yahoo Entertainment, Mark Steven Johnson revealed that pretty much every Hollywood leading man at the time was being considered for Matt Murdock, such as Guy Pearce, Edward Norton, and funnily enough, Matt Damon, but all of them either turned it down or were turned away. Seth Rogen was even considered for Foggy Nelson, which I personally would have loved to have seen, until those lawyer shoes were eventually filled by future Cowboys and Aliens director Jon Favreau.
What, like the alligators in the sewers?
There are alligators in the sewers. Don't ride my ass about the alligators. I got a friend in sanitation, okay? He's seen them.
It seems, however, that it was perhaps Kevin Smith's personal friendship with Ben Affleck as to what caused the sum of all fears star to accept the role. Back then, he was having a very inconsistent run at the box office and was in no less than 3 movies per year in the early 2000s, so for every Armageddon or Pearl Harbor, there was a Reindeer Games or Bounce. But since he had a superhero jaw and name awareness, it was most likely good enough for 20th Century Fox. In fact, Fox producers on the film were reticent that they needed well-known stars to counteract the fact that Daredevil himself wasn't, which led to the casting of Colin Farrell as Bullseye and Jennifer Garner as Elektra. For the role of Kingpin, Mr. Johnson wanted an imposing physical figure and so decided to cast against type with the late great Michael Clarke Duncan, a casting choice that was sadly pretty controversial back then, but one that Mark has always fiercely defended.
Somebody always does.
Filming began in 2002, but even before the camera started rolling, 20th Century Fox and Mr. Johnson butted heads on where it would actually shoot. To get an authentic big city feeling, Mark wanted to film in both New York City and a specific area of Los Angeles that would make for a great stand-in for Hell's Kitchen. While Fox, of course, wanted to save money by filming in Vancouver or Montreal. Ben Affleck chimed in on this debate as well, saying he did not want to film in Canada under any circumstances. Yeah, fuck you too, buddy. But this did seem to move the needle a little bit. So Mark eventually got his way, which, in the grand scheme of things, was a very, very small victory. He threw himself into the project with a lot of admirable gusto, trying his best to replicate specific shots and moments from the comic onto celluloid, even if some of that material wouldn't go on to be seen by theater goers. One such example was the, spoiler warning, death of Elektra Natchios, which saw several shots that were in the original script and were meant to hammer home the grittier edge that Mark wanted, but were ultimately cut against his wishes. That's a scene I'm particularly proud of. It's really panel for panel out of Frank Miller's comic. Bullseye saying, "You're good, but I'm magic," and slashing Elektra's throat with a playing card, followed by her crawling on her hands and knees with blood coming out. This vulgar display of violence, however, seemed to be a bit too much for Fox execs though, as Johnson would go on to explain. They were like, "It's pretty gruesome." I do remember getting some blowback on that because her death was quite graphic. Cutting down violent scenes is of course part and parcel for action-adventure films, but the problem was that Mr. Johnson and those that read his early script were excited by the prospect of a darker, hard R rating for a Daredevil film. But part of the deal with Fox was that it now had to adhere to a PG-13 rating at most. Of course, one could easily point to the fact that Blade had gone on to be quite a hit despite its R rating, but Fox obviously weren't interested in silly vampire movies, and were focused squarely on X-Men and Spider-Man money bucks. Another big aspect of making sure movies turn a profit is their running time. The shorter a film is, the more showings you can cram in a day, and the more overpriced popcorn you can shove down a viewer's gullet. Unfortunately, Mark's script, that once again most movie news outlets raved about, would see the biggest impact of this money-making measure, and in many eyes would irreparably damage the final film. Mr. Johnson did not mince any words when asked about the huge amount of material that was eventually excised from his vision of Daredevil. Looking back on it, one of the mistakes I made with the film was wanting to put everything in. I wanted to do Daredevil's origin story, and I wanted to do the Elektra saga, and I wanted to introduce Bullseye and Foggy. I wanted everything to be in there, but the film could only support so much. And then when you're told to cut a half hour out and make it more of a love story, things start to feel rushed and not quite right. It's a fan thing. When you love something so much, you want to tell it all. And while bloat is certainly something you want to avoid in most stories, like too many superfluous characters and plotlines, the chunk of material that was ultimately dumped from Daredevil by many accounts made it a better film. As I'm sure many of you know, this chunk of material contained a lawyer-focused plotline involving the late rapper Coolio and was intended to further flesh out Foggy and Matt's relationship.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
But since this sequence didn't really support the romance between Daredevil and Elektra, it was removed at Fox's behest, along with several other small trims throughout the film. One of the bittersweet things is that my director's cut had more of everything, and all of that got kind of condensed. At least a quarter of the movie was cut out, and there was a lot more character development that was lost. It's just more complete. Some people love the movie and some people hate the movie, but almost everybody likes the director's cut. It's funny because it was advertised as a daring new vision, and I was like, no, that was the original vision. But none of us were excited about the cut that came out. You know what I mean? When you put a lot of work into something and then you see a quarter of it get cut out, it's always disheartening.
I didn't see the movie. I'm sure it's a funny joke, but I didn't see it.
This very much did reflect on the critical reception when Daredevil released on February 14, 2003, with many taking issue with the redesigned costumes, the over-reliance on licensed music, the lack of character development, and the family-friendly level of violence.
I said...
While it came in at a relatively modest budget of $75 million, it trailed far behind the massive global takes of both Spider-Man and X-Men, sitting somewhere in the neighborhood of $179 million when all was said and done. Fortunately, the director's cut did a fair amount to salvage the movie's reputation when it released on DVD the following year, but some of that goodwill was then soured with the release of the 2005 Elektra spin-off, which didn't even manage to turn a profit and remains one of the lowest rated comic book adaptations ever. Oddly enough, Ben Affleck did shoot a cameo as Daredevil for this ill-conceived dumpster fire. He was dating Miss Garner at the time, but it was cut at the last second for unknown reasons, most likely because such a cameo would have promised a third Daredevil adjacent project, and I suppose nobody at Fox wanted to commit to that. In fact, during the Yahoo interview, Mark Steven Johnson slated that had been the original plan. Once Elektra had released and would assuredly go on to be an unmitigated success, they would re-team for a Daredevil sequel, but obviously that never happened. 20th Century Fox did try several times to get a new project off the ground before Marvel would regain the rights again, and it seemed like for a little while the stars might have aligned to do just that. Michael Clark Duncan had expressed interest to return with a slimmer build. Johnson was down to direct once again, but it was Mr. Affleck who was, let's say, less than enthusiastic at the prospect of donning the Crimson Cowl. By playing a superhero in Daredevil, I have inoculated myself from ever playing another superhero. Wearing a costume was a source of humiliation for me, and something I wouldn't want to do again soon. And he never did. Anyway, former 20th Century Fox executive and current head of Sony Pictures, Tom Rothman, even had the gall to say in 2008, "A Daredevil reboot is something we are thinking very seriously about. What it really needs is, it needs a visionary at the level that Chris Nolan was. It needs a director, honestly, who has a genuine vision." Which, Mark Steven Johnson had, but you told him to cut all of that out. By the way, Tom Rothman is the Fox exec who felt that Deadpool was not a viable character and ordered him to have his mouth sewn shut in X-Men Origins Wolverine. So that precisely exhibits just how much he knows about vision.
Hey, it's me! Don't scratch!
So once Fox gave up trying to get their shit together, the rights to Daredevil then indeed reverted back to Marvel, with them inking a multi-project deal with Netflix in 2012, and the rest, as they say, is history. So while the current TV form of Daredevil is probably much closer to the tone that Mark Steven Johnson had originally been aiming for, he fortunately admires just how far the Man Without Fear has come when asked about the Netflix and now Disney Plus version. I think Vincent D'Onofrio is wonderful as the Kingpin. It's all about finding the right actor for the character, Vincent is a great Kingpin, and Michael was also a great Kingpin. And the show is just terrific. It's fun because everybody gets to have their imprint on it. You don't own the character, you just get to be the steward for a short time and then pass it on for someone else to do something cool with it. And while he had to contend with bickering execs and producers on both Daredevil and, I'd imagine, during his time directing the first Ghost Rider, I might have to cover that one day, it's refreshing that Mr. Johnson still looks at the positive side of bringing these larger-than-life characters to the silver screen. Despite it all, it was a wonderful shoot. We were on the rooftops of downtown LA or in New York City late at night, and it was just fun. It was its own world that you create around it. Even though there was a lot of pressure on me as the director, there was still an incredible on-set vibe.
The horn and the top of the helmet, like, doom, So you break it like this, and kind of frame it.
And that's the story of the Devil of Hell's Kitchen's first live-action adaptation. And no, we don't talk about that one. But if you know of any other gripping or gritty tales of development from the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or jump on over to the rooftops of my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Walloping web snappers! It's another amazing, spectacular, ultimate, superior episode of the mediocre Spider-Man. What happened? The show that lifts up the troubled stories of video games and movies with all the proportional strength of a purple-suited skeleton man. I'll never be as cool as Spider-Man. Anyway, speaking of never being cool, Spider-Man 3! With arachnid-based radioactivity sweeping the world this week, it's as good as time as any to take a step back into the long-forgotten age of the mid-2000s, where the adventures of the cinematic superhero were gearing up with such blockbusters as Catwoman, Fantastic Four, and on top of them all, Sky High. Oh god, we have it so good nowadays. Back then, the crown jewel of the genre was of course director Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, which adapted the exploits of noted turbo nerd Peter Parker and his superhero secret identity. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's creation proved to be box office gold, and with the massive success of the first two movies, Raimi and Sony Pictures were swinging into high as they launched into pre-production on a third film almost immediately after the last. 3 years later, the film was set to debut in Cineplexes in May of 2007, where, Matt sense.
This is something else.
Brief recap. 2004's Spider-Man 2 went well, very well in fact, as it was the second biggest box office success of that year, right behind the turgid girth of the mighty Shrek 2. So everyone knew that a follow-up would have the potential to be even bigger, but both Raimi and Sony had different ideas on how to do that. If you've seen Spider-Man 1 or 2, you'll know that Raimi is a huge fan of the character's adventures throughout the 60s and early 70s, because by the 80s he was making up his own stories by drenching Bruce Campbell in green slime. When Raimi began thinking up potential stories for a third film, his first instinct was to introduce Sandman as the main villain, with Harry Osborn's storyline remaining more or less the side plot. So combining those two antagonistic forces with Mary Jane and Peter's relationship was going to be the main thrust of the film. This was the original story pitch for Spider-Man 3. However, man, I say that a lot, there was pressure from Sony Pictures to raise the stakes, as they wanted to see additional villains for Spidey to fight because that type of shit sells more toys.
Wanna put some dirt in your eye?
Raimi acquiesced to this and felt he could find room to squeeze in the Vulture, another golden oldie, into the story he was already pondering. This phase of pre-production actually got far enough that Raimi was looking to cast Sir Ben Kingsley, best known for his role in the cinematic classic Blood Rain, as Adrian Toomes. Now, while this technically should have satiated the demand to raise the stakes, it wasn't exactly what Sony Pictures and especially infamous mega-producer Avi Arad had in mind. Avi has had a long but limited career, with the bulk of it producing the early 2000s superhero schlock I made fun of earlier in this very script. Out of the dozens of films and their posters he has had his name slapped on, Spider-Man was probably the one he was most proud of, but ironically it was with his interjection that caused the series to end with a wet, shameful spider fart.
See you, chump. What the hell?
He took Raimi aside and explained that he should really consider dropping Vulture to include more characters that younger fans of the old webhead had grown up with, and Avi was concerned that Raimi was simply picking the villains he personally liked and wasn't taking into account the rest of the fanbase. Now, any guesses as to which villain Sony and Arad wanted? Was it A. Cardiac, B. Kane, C. Venom, or D. It was Venom. They wanted Venom. Now, while they were suggesting this as some sort of benevolent gesture to Spidey fans the world over, Sony had a secret back pocket plan that even Raimi was unbeknownst to. While initially a villain, Venom evolved throughout the 90s and became the Lethal Protector, an anti-hero that had no qualms killing the bad guys, whether they be security guards, other symbiotes, or schlubs wearing big dumb metal suits. Sony was acutely aware of Venom's popularity and wanted to spin him off into his own series of films all the way back then, and felt that by introducing him into what was going to be, at that time, the biggest, most expensive superhero movie ever was a surefire way to do it. Raimi resisted, explaining that Venom was a character from well after his time, and felt that Eddie Brock lacked humanity and wasn't really interested in bringing him onto the silver screen.
When are you gonna give a guy a break?
Now, I'm not sure what reading material Raimi was provided with or perused himself to get up to speed on the character, but if it was the really early 90s stuff, I can't really blame him for feeling that way. Venom was pretty one-dimensional at that time, he just looked super cool, but he was a loner that simply wanted to kill Spider-Man for a perceived slight, and whose personality was quite alien-like. Raimi did a fantastic job humanizing a mad scientist with metal tentacles fused to his spinal cord, but simply felt he couldn't do the same with Eddie Brock. Avi persisted, however, hammering home the fact that there were whole other generations of Spidey fans who had waited decades to see the character in a motion picture. And he reminded Sam that he had already gotten to include his other Golden Age favorites like Goblin, Science Squid, and was still getting a crack at Sandman. After enough pressure, Raimi eventually relented, as this became a sort of make or break part of the deal. If he didn't want to be replaced, he was going to have to inject some... This move, unfortunately, doomed the entire movie from a variety of standpoints, with the main one being Venom's complicated origins that couldn't just be explained away by going, "Here's Venom!" You can't have Peter running off into the Secret Wars or bring in Jonah's son again and do a moon landing thing, then you gotta do Man-Wolf. I'm getting off track here. Point being, introducing the black suit was always going to dominate the script, at the expense of pretty much everything else. The scriptwriter for Spider-Man 3, Alvin Sargent, who also did Spider-Man 2, found himself overwhelmed with everything he had to shoehorn in there. The black suit, Goblin, Sandman, Peter, Mary Jane, Ursula and the cookies. There was just so much stuff that by the end, there wasn't a whole lot of room for Eddie/Venom, ironically enough.
If you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, let's not forget Gwen Stacy. She's in there. I don't know why. She doesn't really have anything to do with this story being told per se, as Mary Jane kind of stole the scene she was famous for. Now, apparently, in an earlier draft that Raimi was toying with, there was going to be an other girl that he wanted to include in more of a minor role. Sony producers then stepped in and had that character changed to be Gwen, which simultaneously beefed up her screen time because that would make the movie better somehow.
Of course!
The script was ballooning in size and complexity with every draft, so much so that Alvin Sargent, for a brief period, began to see whether or not he could separate the script into two, which of course would have led to a two-parter. This might have actually been the better option looking back, but unfortunately, no matter how hard he and even the producers tried, they couldn't find an appropriate point in the storytelling where the film could be split. So it would remain a single overstuffed experience. Once the arduous script writing process was done, the arduous filming of the movie then kicked off. It was a grueling 110 days of continuous shooting, with a release date that absolutely could not budge, May 4th, 2007. Trying to hammer out the script is where a lot of time was lost, as Sam, his brother Ivan, and Alvin Sargent spent almost 2 years trying to do so. In terms of on-set problems, Bryce Dallas Howard was unknowingly pregnant while having to shoot stomach-churning stunt sequences suspended from a harness to get in all of her action scenes. Sam Raimi himself was working incredibly long hours, having to sometimes dash between 7 different sets all on the same day to get everything on a shot list to keep on schedule. Thomas Hayden Church, who played Sandman, recalled they really should have cloned Sam back when the first Spider-Man was making 400-something million. They should have had 6 Sams direct this movie. The dentures that Eric Foreman had to wear were ill-fitting and caused him considerable pain whenever he filmed a scene post-symbiosis. Ah, right, Topher Grace. His version of Venom felt, how should I put this, slapped in there at the very last second, and guess what? He felt like a very one-dimensional villain. The dialogue and the way he played Eddie was also not what fans expected, almost as if the movie was being directed by someone who didn't really get Venom's appeal. Many fans didn't care for Grace's performance and felt he wasn't a good match for the character, especially physically.
Yeah, a little chunky.
Which was something that Grace himself agreed with when Raimi had casted him. My first reaction was, this is probably a really bad idea. People are religious about not straying too far from the page. Well, that's just what Raimi wanted to do, since he didn't find Venom's original guise and motivations all that interesting. With Eddie, they were going for more of a similar but different doppelganger-style take on the character, both mentally and physically, rather than the hulking beast seen in the comics. If that was the case though, then Raimi should have just used Spidey's actual doppelganger. I mean, no, wait, that's a terrible idea. What was I thinking? Despite all of this though, the cast and crew did complete the mammoth shoot on time, getting all the footage they needed, which was then passed off to the special effects and CGI teams. Say what you want about the script, the casting, the dialogue, pretty much everything, but Spider-Man 3 knocked it out of the park with the Sandman effects. It's why Raimi chose to include the character in the first place. Visually, he was always going to be impressive. All of the special effects in the world, however, can't save clunky storytelling and underbaked characters. While it certainly retains much of Raimi's flair and sense of fun, it was bogged down with so much stuff that it just failed to be a truly satisfying finale. While lots of mediocre to terrible superhero fare was flying into cinemas around that time, the Spider-Man series was up to that point seen as the cream of the crop, but the very divisive reception to Spidey 3 proved that even the greatest heroes could fail, fall, die trying. But, and this is a very big but, the hype leading up to its release was some monolithic shit, making it the most financially successful entry in the trilogy, which was enough for Sony and Raimi to continue their somewhat strained relationship. Everyone on the inside knew it was an exhausting film to write, shoot, and promote, so many on the creative and business sides weren't 100% sure that the series would even continue. 3 blockbuster tentpole releases in 8 years in a row is a lot for just one director, so there were questions whether Raimi would return, or if the reins of the franchise would be handed off to somebody else or rebooted. Kristen Dunst certainly had an opinion on this back in 2007. It's disrespectful to the whole team, I think, to do that, and audiences aren't stupid. It'd be a big flop without me. It'd be a big flop without me, Toby, or Sam. That would be really not the smartest move, but they know that already. Sony co-chair Amy Pascal would never do that. Oof, slap that one up on poorly aged, if you please. Negotiations between Raimi and Sony began after a long, extended break, with the goal being to hash out a deal for Spider-Man 4, but it just as quickly fell apart. Raimi insisted on Vulture as the main villain this time, with John Malkovich now in the role, but Sony wanted the Lizard, and since neither side wanted to go through this song and dance again, they agreed to disagree. The deal never got off the ground, and these preliminary plans were very publicly cancelled, and since none of the principal actors wanted to return without Raimi's involvement, they didn't. Therefore, mere hours after the news hit that Spidey 4 was a no-go, Sony announced they already had a reboot script in the works by James Vanderbilt. Whoa, isn't that a funny coincidence? It's almost as if they had planned this all along. This reboot then of course became the Amazing Spider-Man film series, which suffered absolutely no problems at all and wasn't a huge clusterfuck in every single way. Now, you'd think after this point, Sony would have treated Spider-Man 3 as some shameful little secret that they would want to wash their hands of, since it was their meddling that ruined it, but never underestimate the greed of capitalism.
Oh, groovy, smashing, yay capitalism!
They put out an editor's cut of the film in 2017, its 10th anniversary, that makes a number of small additions and alternate takes, along with 2 major ones. Flint Marko has a scene where he tries to connect to his daughter by making a sandcastle, giving his character a bit more weight, as well as Harry's redemption coming from a completely different and more natural source. What this cut isn't, however, is some drastically improved vision of Spider-Man 3 that corrects its most egregious mistakes. A simple marketing stunt by Sony to squeeze more money out of Spider-Man fanboys, yes, I bought it. Now, unlike most directors, Sam Raimi has always been willing to discuss some of his more shaky projects, and despite his best intentions, he admits Spider-Man 3 is one of those projects. It's a movie that just didn't work very well. I tried to make it work, but I didn't really believe in all the characters, so that couldn't be hidden from people who love Spider-Man. If the director doesn't love something, it's wrong of them to make it when so many other people love it. I think raising the stakes after Spider-Man 2 was the thinking going into it, and I think that's what doomed us. I should have just stuck with the characters and the relationships and progressed them to the next step and not tried to top the bar. Unfortunately, he also took the fan backlash from the movie particularly harshly, as it was enough to scare him away from tackling any other superheroes for more than a decade. I didn't know that I could face it again because it was so awful having been the director of Spider-Man 3. The internet was getting revved up and people disliked that movie and they sure let me know about it, so it was difficult. But then I found out there was an opening for Doctor Strange 2. My agent called me and said, "They're looking for a director at Marvel for this movie and your name came up. Would you be interested?" And I thought, I wonder if I can still do it. They're really demanding those types of pictures. And I felt, well, that's reason enough. I didn't think I would ever be doing another superhero movie. It just happened. Truth be told, over the years, Spider-Man 3 has slowly accrued this so bad it's good style quality. The wild swings in tone, the 7 different storylines, the cheesy dialogue, the campy performances, and the bonkers special effects are all stacked and layered into this sugary shit cake that's not good for you, but you can't help but want to take a bite every so often.
So good.
Now, Sam Raimi loves Spider-Man and considers those films, the first 2 at least, a highlight of his career, so it's always a shame that due to creative differences and internal pressure that it ended so sourly. It just goes to show that even if you launch into a creative project with tons of hype, financial freedom, and experience backing you, that the greatest battle still lies within. If you know of any other mismanaged Marvel misfires, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or wall crawl up to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big J. Jonah Jameson to nominate the game or movie you want me to cover in our next video. See you next time, and thanks for watching! Welcome once again to another episode of What Happened, the show where we 24/7, 365. But no one is better at taking their fans for a ride than Capcom, the seminal Japanese publisher / developer who's probably responsible for everything you've ever liked about video games. However, that ride has undoubtedly had some peaks and valleys along the way, as some of those Capcom franchises or characters that you fell in love with have since been blipped from history. Nowadays, though, if you're into Resident Evil, Devil May Cry, or Phoenix Wright, you have it pretty good in all honesty, but there's one fan base that have it not so pretty good, and those are the ones that maybe supported Capcom the most, and that's the PN09 fans. Fighting game fans. The last several years have been kind of very rough for a variety of reasons, be it lukewarm launches, poor communication, or iffy DLC practices. But while Street Fighter V more or less managed to turn itself around, Capcom's only other fighting game of this generation, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, has to be one of, if not the biggest failure in the realm of fisticuffing. Yeah, you hear that, Cross-Tekken? You're off the hook! Yeah, we knew you could do it.
Whoa, slow down there. Did you really think you were gonna hog this subject all to yourself?
Why, if it isn't Guinness Book of World Records winner for most subscribed channel that specializes in fighting games, Maximilian, dude! Hey there!
Hello, Matthew.
Stop calling me that. Anyway, with Max's help, we're gonna be tag teaming to break down the long, tragic journey of Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. So, without further ado,
let's go!
So grab your time stone and let's travel back to one of the most glorious years in all of the years, 1994. The world was fertile and vibrant, and blessed with many natural wonders such as Jamie Lee Curtis in True Lies, Ace of Base, Donkey Kong Country.
But that's all garbage. Why? Because X-Men Children of the Atom. That's why. This absolute magnum dick of a fighting game set a new standard for graphics and gameplay in the arcades, as it took full advantage of Capcom's CPS2 board. It also set an exciting precedent for fans of comics or video games in general.
Oh, if Capcom is making Marvel games, what if both sides clash in an epic struggle? What if Ryu could Dragon Punch Cyclops? What if Zangief could pile drive Cyclops? And what if M. Bison could kill Cyclops? Unfortunately, those questions would go unanswered for about 2 years, because then X-Men vs. Street Fighter was released.
Thus kicked off half a decade of amazing, manic, over-the-top, combative fanboying between two pop culture powerhouses. This culminated in 2000 as it saw Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes released, which really cemented the legacy of Capcom vs. Fighters. Clocking in at 56 goddamn characters, upping the teams to an insane 3 vs. 3, and introducing my personal favorite, the sexy seductress, Amingo. Marvel 2 established itself as an absolute classic. Things only got more hype from there, as the unbalanced but nevertheless fun and deep gameplay exploded in popularity just 2 years later, as it was heavily featured in the early EVOs, becoming a pillar of the fighting game community.
Then for a long time, nothing happened. During these dark ages, fighting games, particularly 2D ones, struggled to find relevance in a marketplace filled with games like Virtua Fighter 4, Dead or Alive 3, and of course, the king of them all, Mortal Kombat Deception. Then, in 2008, Capcom returned to the arena with Street Fighter 4, which proved to be a sales success, and felt they needed to capitalize on this fighting game renaissance while it was hot, and what better follow-up than clashing once again with the Marvel Universe. Things had changed since the late 90s, however, and rather than being almost out of business, business was a boomin', and a whole heap of Marvel heroes now had maximum mainstream exposure. We're talking about guys like Iron Money, Hot God, and Captain Duty, and since his movie was in the works at that time, they threw in Sassy Doctor as well.
Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Fate of Two Worlds released in 2011, with one of the worst logos ever, and longtime fans lost their collective shit. The game featured a bold comic book art style, had a great balance of fan favorites and newcomers, and was generally really fun to play. A lot of skeptics, however, assumed Capcom would just put out a better version a few months later, which they did. But hey, Ultimate Marvel 3 had some awesome new additions and was seen as a superior iteration. With that being said, the game definitely needed some balance changes, but official support had dried up and Capcom wasn't talking. The next time Marvel 3 was mentioned was when it was delisted from all digital services in late 2013. In fact, this even kicked off lots of Marvel franchises, disappearing from the Digiverse, including Marvel Origins Collection and its terrible, terrible box art. This move to start regaining their franchises that they had licensed out to companies that were now smaller than them and infinitesimal next to Disney is a behavior that would be intrinsically linked to Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite's eventual fate.
In December of 2016, Capcom announced a new game in the series at PSX. What's PSX, you ask? Well, it was a big PlayStation-themed show that Sony just stopped doing. Now, this was a bit odd. Why didn't Capcom show it at E3 or EVO? PSX wasn't exactly the biggest venue to show off a brand new fighting game, especially one that was multi-platform, so why not just wait until E3?
No, there's something else. Something ugly. Something malignant.
Regardless, people were excited because the MCU was now, doing pretty good. But hardcore Marvel players were a bit more subdued. Infinite reverted back to the 2v2 setup of its roots, and Infinity Stones were added to the main gameplay loop, which would be the replacement for that third character. While it was nice that Capcom were shaking things up, some people thought they detected the memorable stench of gems from Cross Tekken, which would thankfully not be the case. One thing, however, that definitely was the case was the suspicious roster. Now, some people were pretty enthusiastic about X's inclusion.
Yo! Fuck you! Oh my god, what the fuck?
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Others felt it was a bit worrisome that there was nary a whiff of a mutant. The months ticked by and it was quiet on all fronts until E3 2017, where Infinite had its first proper unveiling. The story mode was highlighted in a new shiny trailer, and it probably shouldn't have. Oh cool, there's Thanos, and there's Frank West and the Rocket, and oh my god.
What would you do if I sang out of tune?
Now, we don't want to harp on this, but it can't be overstated how Chun-Li's creepy porcelain baby face stuffed in a sausage casing permanently damaged the fan perception of Marvel from then on out. No one on the greater internet was talking about the gameplay, the Infinity Stones, or the story itself because...
Just take a look at this.
Also, get a load of Captain Duty. Woof. So, why did certain characters like Monster Mash over here look like Monster Mash over here? Conversely, why the new fighters look pretty sharp? Well, there's a good reason for that, or a bad reason, really. Because the developmental details of a lot of Capcom projects, especially those tied up by a bunch of NDA psych locks, aren't really privy to the public. Thankfully, though, almost 2 years since its debut, enough pieces of the puzzle have been put together and enough lips have gotten ever so looser.
Close to the launch of the game, some staff within Capcom, under anonymity, revealed that the budget for Infinite wasn't exactly high, with one quote putting it succinctly by describing it as cheap as shit. While exact numbers are not known, Marvel's entire budget for the base game was comparable to just one season of DLC for Street Fighter V. Now, Capcom's flagship fighter did have additional backing by Sony, but seemingly no such deal was put into place for Infinite. Thus, it's safe to assume Capcom was funding most of it, if not all of the game, by themselves, and they weren't exactly splurging on it.
Now, how do you cut costs in a fighting game?
Well, you just do what you do in the old days. See?
Okay, so let's compare, say, Venom and Dante. Notice the distinct drops in quality here, and here? Well, that's because they just grabbed Dante's model or his animations from Marvel 3, a game with a very different art style, and just plopped them into Infinite. Do that a few dozen times and you have your roster. What's more is that both games ran on vastly different engines, as Capcom's proprietary MT framework, which they have since abandoned, powered the comic book contrast in Marvel 3, whereas Infinite used Unreal 4, which powers just about every other fighting game nowadays. This might have caused some awkwardness.
Look!
Speaking of art styles, many fans pointed out Infinite's lack of one. Maybe Capcom didn't want this to be seen as a mere upgrade to Marvel 3, so a softer, more semi-realistic look was chosen instead. It was pretty apparent that most of the models looked rushed and sorta cheap, while the new fighters had a considerably more polished look. According to anonymous Capcom staff, these issues were raised to the higher-ups who were producing the game. The concerns, however, were apparently waved off, citing that it was a non-issue as no one would notice.
Yeah, well, I want it on record that this is a bad idea.
Now, while this has a modicum of truth to it, as all the frantic action and screen-filling special moves would make it nigh impossible to discern such detail, but that doesn't hold true if you say, then zoom in on the Crypt Keeper during your story mode trailer.
Not content with just that, Capcom released a downloadable demo for said story mode that same E3 weekend to spread positive word of mouth about the game.
So, what the hell happened?
It didn't. Now, it might have been a good idea on paper, but this demo could have possibly done more harm than good. There was no versus component of any kind, no training, and was compromised of just a few limp fights against computer-controlled drones. That was it. Even as a product promoting a story mode, it did little to excite, and also prevented people from really experimenting with the gameplay, Infinite's best feature. That was the one thing people were actually pumped about, as everyone playing Versus on the E3 show floor were having a blast. But the majority of fans sitting at home were getting a vastly different experience.
One more thing that happened during E3 2017 that, in conjunction with all the other bad press, formed a type of icky paste that just gooped onto Marvel Infinite and never let go. That, of course, being Nintendo, Namco, and Arc System Works literally announcing another fighting franchise that had a dynamic art style, 3 vs 3 tag matches, and featured legendary characters known the world over, you can't do nothing about that. While competition is a good thing and it should strive to push two products to be better, it didn't really pan out that way. More on that later. Oh wait, more on that now. Simply put, Marvel's chances at making some type of impact were dunked into a coffin from outer space by Android 16 and then nuked. Everything Infinite lacked, Fighters had, and more. Not to mention, Namco scheduled the first public beta for DBZ the exact same weekend as Marvel's launch.
Convenient.
Intentional or not, in the FGC at least, this was seen as the darkest of shades. The memes and shitposting came sliding in hot and wet across social media, so the public opinion again was a bit skewed.
Then, fortunately, actually things got even worse. Speculation over the lack of X-Men or Fantastic Four characters was no longer unfounded, but was in fact very much found. Near the end of 2017, Marvel put all X-Men books on hiatus as they were embroiled with the disputes from 20th Century Fox over the characters. Then they relaunched X-Men later that year, but the Fantastic Four? They had been in the crap shack since 2014, as Marvel had been devaluing the brand, so Fox would just give up and relinquish the rights. And we could, get good Fantastic Four movies for once. This was ruthless, by the way. Marvel was scrubbing them off any media they could. Hell, the Fantastic Four logo was even taken off bombastic Bagman's bag in Spider-Man Unlimited.
She even took the ice cube trays out of the freezer. What kind of a sick bitch takes the ice cube trays out of the freezer?
Pettiness like that goes all the way back to Marvel 3, as the producer of that title, one Ryota Nitsuma, admitted they weren't the easiest company to work with, and cited a specific example where they would stall development, agonizing over the details of Doctor Strange's hand movements. Other anonymous Capcom staff also stated whenever they would request the use of certain characters, they would often get rebuffed from Marvel if they had no plans to use them within the MCU. One such instance was with the goddamn Juggernaut and his very, very tight suit. Capcom wanted the big jugs to return, but Marvel had no interest in pushing him, and in fact, Capcom were the ones who fought for characters like X-23 and Deadpool to be included in Fate of Two Worlds, and only after sustained campaigning for them would Marvel relent. Capcom tried their best to gather the most interesting heroes and villains they could, but if you have a partner who's difficult or unwilling to play ball, there's not much you can do. Therefore, Infinite would have no Sentinel, Magneto, Doctor Doom, or etc., and despite them usually being at odds with each other, both the FGC and casual audience came together to hate this as a united people. Capcom obviously couldn't go with the whole "it's Marvel's fault" route, so instead they went with the whole "characters are just functions" approach.
Then, producer of Capcom's fighting games Peter Combo Fiend Rosas famously said in an interview, "If you were to actually think about it, these characters are just functions, they're just doing things. Magneto, case in point, is a favorite because he has 8-way air dash and he's really fast, right? Well, guess what? Nova can do the same thing. Captain Marvel can do the same thing. It's just a function that people are associating with the character, and there's no shortage of that. We wanted to make sure that if a legacy of characters doesn't happen to make the roster this time, that playstyle would still be represented." The quote did certainly rub a lot of people the wrong way, but Combo Fiend couldn't exactly throw Marvel under the bus over this, so he had to take some tact when these issues came up and present to you some tact. Looking back on it, this is literally the only thing he could have said, so as to keep the heat off any one group. And I'd imagine if he had been even 1% more provocative in his answer, Disney would make sure there would be a severed Beta Ray Bill head under his sheets that night.
Infinite launched on September 19th, 2017, less than a year since its reveal, and a few months shy of releasing alongside one of the biggest movie events of all time, Avengers: Infinity War. Not the most synergistic time frame from a marketing perspective. One of the biggest advantages of a crossover title like this, a colorful cast of characters and a fantastical storyline, wasn't really being used to its full potential. Why they didn't wait a few more months to be closer to the hype of Infinity War is a journey into mystery itself, and considering the state of the game, more time in development wouldn't have hurt it. So with this negative perception circulating around the game, what with its lack of an exciting roster and more enticing alternatives on the horizon, it's no surprise that all these foibles masked Infinite's best quality, its gameplay. Very quickly, people realized the Infinity Stone system didn't hurt Marvel, but only strengthened it. It functioned more like the grooves in earlier Capcom titles and led to lots of creativity and combo potential. Characters from Marvel 3, aside from their looks, got some fun changes, and the new cast received similar praise as well. Most reviews took these positives into account, claiming that the core game was really enjoyable. However, the ho-hum graphics, the lifeless stages, the stunted roster, drab menus and presentation, and the mediocre story mode were not enough to balance everything out.
Then, within days of launching, Capcom announced that a lineup of DLC characters were coming soon. Suspiciously soon. The 6 fighters would include Black Panther, Venom, Monster Hunter, and the rest. And while not known at the time, it has since been revealed that all 6 were originally scheduled to be in the starting lineup. Producers on the project felt it would be better to cut them from launch and make them DLC, as they didn't even have a long-term roadmap for future content.
Yeah, because that always works out great.
Or if they did, had scrapped it. This is partially evidenced by both Monster Hunter and Black Panther appearing within the story mode, with the latter also getting their own Wakandan-themed stage. The first 3 were added 30 days after the game launched, and all 6 were made available in less than 3 months, which also marked the last bit of content the game would ever receive.
Also, Filipino Champ let the world know that there was originally going to be maybe 61 characters and 18 stages, but aside from that, I think we've covered the cavalcade of bad decisions and worst timing that plagued Marvel Infinite, one of the biggest fighting game disasters.
But what about Evo?
Right, okay, now it's time to talk about this. Not only did Infinite's September release put it far away from Avengers hype, it also missed out on EVO 2017 as well. Marvel would have to survive a good 6 months to hopefully get picked for next year's championship series. During said announcement stream of the lineup, Mr. Wizard listed the games that would make the main stage, and Infinite was not among them, although 2 other tag-focused games, DBZ Fighters and Blaze Blue Cross Tag Battle Ruby Thing, did. Mr. Wizard stated this was due to lack of participation from the community, as well as low stream numbers during other tournaments. Many people felt this was unfair, as Marvel's numbers in those areas were not bad by any stretch and rivaled or surpassed other games, especially Cross Tag Battle, whose numbers were 0 since it wasn't even released when the EVO announcement was made. What's more is that this was the first time in 16 years that a Marvel vs. fighting game would have no main stage presence.
After the live stream, Markman, another EVO representative, and Stick God, made comments that inferred Infinite's exclusion was not due to Capcom or even EVO themselves, saying, "I go to many FGC events, probably the most outside of sponsored players. I know that MVCI is being played, but it's hard to include a game that doesn't have support. I'm not talking about Capcom because they've supported it the most. We've had meetings with some pubs and devs about including their title as a main game at EVO. You know what? We didn't get the blessing that we hope for sometimes. We actively have to seek permission and/or content licenses to be able to include certain games."
Why exactly did this happen? Well, while not confirmed, internally, Infinite was seen as a failure due to the online backlash, the reaction to the roster, the reviews, take your pick.
But we were exposed.
So, since the perception of Marvel was so poor, trying to improve it with more DLC, or graphical adjustments, or even an ultimate version, was felt as a waste of money, which no company wants to do. Instead, it would simply be better to wash their hands of the whole thing and just move on. Hell, Marvel was already doing that with Fantastic Four by just ignoring their existence, so why not do the same here? The last patch that the game received that fixed a few bugs was in January of 2018, so that was 5 months of official support and then just nothing. Like Cross-fucking Tekken had a better shelf life than that, for shock's sake.
It was at EVO! Fortunately though, Infinite did make up for all this failure by at least selling what Capcom projected, which was about 2 million copies in the first fiscal Time Stone! Failed to sell 2 million copies, and instead barely sold half of Capcom's projections. This was less than Marvel 3 had managed to move 6 years earlier, by the way, and since the MCU brand was more popular than Jesus, well, that ain't good.
We are now almost 2 years away from Infinite's launch, and things are different. Disney now owns 20th Century Fox, so the X-Men and the Fantastic Four are back in the fold, all the comics are getting relaunched, and just look at the cover of Ultimate Alliance 3. It involves Thanos and the gems, and goddamn Wolverine is front and center, slapping you with his hairy adamantium dong. There's even gonna be a DLC pack for the Fantastic Four. Oh, man.
Listen, it's pretty clear that Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite got dealt a bad hand. The timing, the competition, the budget, everything was working against it. And many of those elements were simply out of Capcom's hands.
Every so often, though, rumors pop up of the game returning in some form, or a full-fledged sequel might even be in the works, but unfortunately, there's no concrete evidence to support that. But still, it makes you think, what if?
My spider sense. I'm picking up nothing.
Thanks so much to my marvelous tag partner Max for the team up.
Hey, no problem, Matt. My name is Max, and I'll see you next time.
And thanks to all you Flophouse VIPers for voting strong and proud and saying, when's Marvel? And if you out there, true believers, know of any other games, fighting or otherwise, you'd like to see on What Happened, punch up your comments below or web swing your way to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially cast your vote on our next video. And that is enough said.